Have you played LA Noire? Well, considering you clicked on this video, I'm assuming you have. And you know what? I have too. Yup, back in 2011 when I was only 9 years old, I played LA Noire for the first time. For sure I was way too young to play it, but from the moment I opened the case and saw those 3 separate discs staring back at me, the game just stuck with me. LA Noire was a game, is a game, unlike any other, that a small dev team from Australia dreamed up one day back in 2004. Team Bondi, led by Brandon McNamara and with the help of Sony, began work on a new project inspired by the countless classic noir detective movies of the late 20th century, from The Third Man to Chinatown. Only 2 years into production though, the publishing rights to the project were handed over to Rockstar, and suddenly this small game expanded into an enormous new IP for the rising studio. Not only did they build an entire new engine from the ground up for the game, but they also built an entire new technology, the motion scan system, a new concept that had allowed for the capture of facial animations in more detail than ever before. This was no side project for Rockstar. No, this was their next big thing, investing $50 million and countless different dev teams into LA Noire to ensure it did what McNamara hoped it would do: change the industry, push the industry forward, and create a whole new IP for Rockstar to add to their incredible catalogue. And after 7 years of development, finally on the 17th of May 2011, they were able to release LA Noire to the world, and along with its critical acclaim, it also instantly became the highest selling new IP of 2011. So how exactly were Rockstar able to have this new IP explode the way it did? How did this small Australian dev team come out of nowhere to create such a widely beloved game? And most importantly, why does LA Noire still resonate with me and so many others 10 years after its release? Let's have a look, shall we? The first thing you notice when you open up LA Noire is the title screen. Well, I suppose that's the first thing you notice about any game you start, but you get my point. As soon as you see those flashing lights, as soon as you hear the melancholic and mysterious saxophone riff of the main theme hit, you're immediately hooked on the atmosphere, the style that this game holds.
Is that LA Noire is dripping with style.
Team Bondi ensured an attention to detail when creating this world that truly immersed you in post-World War II LA, starting with the title screen, but carrying over to every inch of the world itself. Whether it be classic movie posters, the massive movie set in the middle of the city, the beautiful score, the radio soundtracks, and the opening cinematics of each case, which are heavily stylized and again take inspiration from the iconic noir movies of the time. Hell, even some of the case titles themselves are named after films like The Fallen Idol and The Driver's Seat. But we'll get to the cases themselves later, because first we need to hear from Herschel Biggs in one of the best opening monologues of any game ever.
A city on the verge of greatness. A new type of city, based not on the man, but on the automobile. The car, the symbol of freedom and vitality. Where every man can own his own home, and have room to breathe, and not be overlooked by his neighbors. A city where a man's home is his castle. A quarter acre of the dream made possible by victory. A city of opportunists. A city of dreams, where Hollywood will shape the thoughts and desires of the entire planet. A city of pioneers. A city of dreamers. A city of undercurrents, where not everything is as it seems. A 20th century city that will become a model for the world. A city that has no boundaries, that will stretch as far as the eye can see.
This monologue, coming from a man we don't even meet until the final act of the game, is in my opinion one of the best pieces of dialogue that's ever come from Rockstar's genius writing team. To begin, Biggs mentions how the explosion of the car industry has changed the fabric of society within the city of LA, a change we see present itself throughout the game not only on the traffic desk, but also by the background subplot of the new LA freeway being built through the streets and homes of countless men and women. Not to mention cars themselves being a core part of the gameplay experience. The driving mechanic of LA Noire was the first Rockstar made after the divisive, ultra-realistic driving style of Grand Theft Auto 4, and it seemed that this time they wanted to strike a better balance between the realism of their Liberty City game with a smoother, easier to handle mechanic that would be more present in the release of GTA 5 2 years later. But what makes this driving system so unique, similarly to all the systems in LA Noire, is the period of the game. Despite the mechanic largely being smooth and simple, the restriction of 1940 era cars gave Team Bondi the challenge of crafting driving that was both fun and realistic, and in my opinion they absolutely nailed it. Driving slowly and following the rules of the road, the player can have an absolute breeze of a time getting from point A to point B, but with the addition of LA traffic, this leads to an absolute snail's pace journey. Picking up the speed, however, is a risky game to play, with cars being tough to control at high speeds, especially when you're trying to make tight corners or close crash encounters. There is a great risk-reward dynamic in the driving in this way, as the end grade of each case you do factors in the vehicle and structural damage you do to the city. So if you want that 5-star result, you either have to be extra cautious or become an absolute master at navigating the grid-like roads of the City of Angels. Biggs then goes on to talk about the benefits and drawbacks of the success LA has seen, the fact that every man can own his own home, his own castle, and not be overlooked by his neighbours. However, it's clear as the game goes on that this isn't the case, that this doesn't apply to every man but only the lucky few, and it's here subtly that the theme of racial inequality sprouts up, a theme which is very present throughout the entirety of LA Noire. With the line, we see a shot of Cole Phelps, our protagonist, kissing his wife and panning back on a clearly middle-class suburban neighbourhood. But these acres of land, these castles, are rarely ever seen to be owned by anyone besides middle-class white families. Whether it be Antonia Maldonado, a married Hispanic woman present in a later case forced to live in a boarding house, or Cornell Tyree and Tyrone Lamont sharing a tiny apartment in the seedy side streets of Hollywood. The game presents a side of LA that brings the systemic racism of the segregation-era city to light. We see Cole, a white middle-class policeman, the embodiment of oppression in the United States, living in a beautiful suburban house with his children, whilst minorities are continually targeted by redlining, by the creation of the freeway destroying what they call home, and by the corrupt LAPD and district attorney that clearly favour prosecuting non-white perpetrators. Next up, we get Biggs mentioning opportunists, as a massive billboard of Leland Monroe appears, a not so subtle hint to the corruption that seeped into every industry of the city. We also see the hope and joy, the glitz and glamour that LA provides, the architecture, the film studios, the actresses lining up to audition, the thriving universities. But as Biggs says, not everything is as it seems. Finally, Biggs says that LA will become a model for the world. It'll be a 20th century city with no boundaries that'll stretch as far as the eye can see. And this final line can be seen so many ways. Of course, in the second half of the 20th century, LA became arguably the most idealized city in the world. It took New York's place as the most influential American city in terms of culture. But it also spawned, or at least brought to the surface, a seedy undercurrent of greed, bigotry and corruption that you can argue spread to the rest of the US and the rest of the world, thanks to the concept of fame and riches that LA presented becoming the norm for people across the globe. Whichever way you look at it, it is undeniable that the US police force has, at least in part, contributed to this corruption over the century, and that's why the idea of playing as a 1940s cop is absolutely perfect in communicating these themes. Speaking of which, the opening segment of LA Noire essentially functions as one massive tutorial, because that's exactly what it is. I mean, the player even has the option to skip it. But it does serve a fair few purposes. Of course, one of these is to introduce the player to the gameplay mechanics, the first of which being the clue finding mechanic. As in the first case, our protagonist Cole Phelps, a simple uniformed police officer, is tasked with finding a single murder weapon in a dark alley. Not only does this opening allow some time for the player to get familiar with the movement and style, but it also introduces another smaller mechanic that provides vital added context throughout the story: the newspapers. Throughout the city, Cole comes across various newspapers in each of his cases, all of which the player can interact with to get a deeper look into the LA underworld. This form of non-linear storytelling acts as a vital build-up to the latter sections of the game, providing context, introducing characters, and creating numerous subplots that run parallel to Cole's story. And these sub-stories are interwoven beautifully, never halting the pacing of the main game. In this first newspaper, we're introduced to Courtney Sheldon, a war veteran and medical student who needs help curing one of his friend's PTSD, and Dr. Harlan Fontaine, a well-respected clinical psychologist, but a man that's clearly not to be trusted.
Every physician has patients that he cannot hope to cure, for whom he can only smooth the path to death.
Returning to the case, Cole finds the pistol used in the murder, and instead of following orders and bringing it back to the station, we immediately get a taste of who Phelps is as a character, as he decides to try and hunt down the owner of the pistol. And whilst you could see this as simply an officer taking initiative, his partner Ralph sees it a different way. He sees Cole trying to get out of his uniform, bootlicking and sucking up to try and climb to the top, letting his ambition get in the way of his police work. Cole himself comes across from the offset as pretty unlikable, at least from what we hear from the conversation he has with Ralph on the drive to the gun store. He talks about how most criminals are stupid, how they act on impulse, and it's that impulse that gets them caught. And although it's a quick line, it not only sets up nearly the entirety of the homicide section of the game, but also foreshadows Cole's greatest downfall. But we'll get to that. These car conversations Cole has with his various partners throughout the game, similarly to the horse riding conversations in Red Dead Redemption, are massively important in how these characters get fleshed out and how their arcs are built up, as it's the main time we see them discuss personal beliefs, and it's for that reason that the player needs to pay attention at all times. Reaching the suspect's apartment, we get our first taste of the melee combat LA Noire holds, a system that is very similar to the likes of Mafia 2, with a dedicated punch, dodge and grapple button and little in the way of variety. It's a functional system that surprisingly doesn't appear too much throughout the game, but when it does, it's usually a swift formality more than a genuine gameplay experience. It's here that we also get fed another bit of non-linear storytelling, as we get our first flashback to 1944, seeing Cole along with Jack Kelso on their way to fight against the Japanese.
The Japanese will do the world a favor and kill you quickly. All three of you are on report. What are your fucking names? Phelps, Kelso.
This first flashback really just serves to set a precedent for their occurrence, not providing much in the way of narrative importance, but laying the foundation of Phelps and Kelso's turbulent relationship. The second case that we face is essentially a massive gunfight. A bank robbery gone wrong, created in order to teach the player the shooting mechanics, which in all reality act as the same clunky system from pretty much every Rockstar game from the time. It's by no means unusable, however the animations do make for a wonky experience, but luckily, unlike most Rockstar games, the gunfights are very much a secondary system of LA Noire. We get another quick war flashback, and this time we get yet another peek into Cole and Kelso's relationship.
They call it the Custer Syndrome. Guys who go around dreaming of fame and glory and getting all of their men killed in the process.
Our duty is to lead, Kelso.
And their duty is to die for your wonderful future?
Two men who, as Biggs puts it, should have been friends if their personalities hadn't got in the way. Cole is clearly a stuck-up, overly ambitious brown nose, with the complete antithesis of Jack's take-no-shit attitude, creating a rivalry that leads to Jack leaving the lieutenant training to join a rifle company and truly get in on the fight. Moving on already to the final case of the patrol desk, Cole just so happens to be walking down the street when he hears gunshots in broad daylight, a brutal murder right in front of a crowd. And here we get our first true investigation. Find clues, ask questions, solve the case. That's the gameplay formula of LA Noire in its simplest form, and here it is brilliant, as after your first interrogation you have enough evidence to lock up the killer for life. But there's one stinger, one aspect of this case that really makes you start questioning the ethics of what you're doing, that being anti-Semitism. Edgar Kalu is a Jew, the man he killed an anti-Semite, and whilst gunning down someone in the street for bigotry is clearly not a punishment that fits the crime, it certainly plants the seed in the player's mind to question the morality of what they're doing. The interrogations themselves are based on the unique motion scan technology Team Bondi used to craft LA Noire's facial models. At the time, this was arguably the most accurate depiction of emotion and character you could get in a game, and so Team Bondi used it in counterpart with clues to create a fantastic interrogation mechanic. Whilst the options of truth, doubt or lie were misleading in the original game, and even after being changed to good cop, bad cop and accused, they were still a bit vague, regardless of that, it's still a unique experience to try and figure out which choice is right based on the people's facial expressions alone. This goes even more so if you accuse someone, as you need evidence to back it up, so connecting old clues to current moments is vital if you want to get an interrogation perfect. Sure, the system has its flaws, but it was the first attempt not only at this specific system, but motion scan technology itself, so I'm more than willing to give it a pass. The case itself is cut and dry, and with it solved, Cole earns himself a promotion from uniformed police officer to traffic detective. And with that, the prologue of L.A. Noire comes to an end. This intro segment does so much fantastic work in setting the game up. In just 45 minutes, it's able to flawlessly establish the tone of the game, the atmosphere of the city, the underlying themes of corruption and prejudice, introduces our main character, sets up multiple subplots, and explains every single gameplay system. And if you ask me, having all of that in a skippable intro really just goes to show how full of life L.A. Noire is, despite its albeit limited gameplay variety. And with that, Cole gets himself a couple of suits and can finally officially call himself a detective. The first case you face as a detective in L.A. Noire is also one of the most memorable. Entering his new office, Cole gets a fair bit of hazing as the new guy, the new golden boy of the LAPD, and is greeted with embarrassment along with his new partner Stefan Bukowski.
I've heard all about you, Phelps. You go easy on me and let me earn the odd citation, and maybe we'll get along fine.
I'm here to learn, Detective.
He's an intense one, isn't he, Mel?
From the moment we meet him, it's clear that Bukowski's a good guy, sharp-witted for sure, and someone who doesn't take any shit. But a good cop knows the ropes, and although he doesn't completely take to Cole immediately, it's clear he just wants the best for Phelps and the department. The case itself is a mysterious one, a Ford coupe abandoned at a train yard, covered in blood, and dripping in signs of foul play. But as you investigate, you notice some strange things about the car, namely the receipt for a live pig in the back of the owner's truck. The owner, Adrian Black, was a married man, and it makes no sense for him to be this far away from home. Before we can go to said home though, we need to talk to Nate Wilkie, the man who discovered the car, a lowly depot worker, and once again, the racial tensions related to the US police start to appear. It's clear, thanks to the fantastic mocap and quality performance, that Wilkie is anxious, borderline terrified for the entire time he's talking to the police, as if he's afraid of being accused of something despite there being no evidence to do so. It may be a small encounter, but that's exactly how L.A. Noire conveys these themes of racial tension so perfectly. There's rarely, if ever, some major, on-the-nose, explicit example of racism and systematic oppression, at least when Roy Earl's not around.
Get your hands off me.
But the consistency of small encounters like these really build up the themes throughout the game, to make them feel like an inherent part of the city and nation itself, which of course at the time they were. Moving on from there though, we get in the car to go to Adrian Black's house and inform his wife that he's missing. But before we can do that, we get a call from the police dispatcher, and it's here we get our first taste of the main side content of L.A. Noire, street crimes. Built as mini side missions that lean on the more action-focused gameplay aspects of L.A. Noire, these street crimes act as quality pieces of side content, sometimes with mini stories built around them, other times simple bank heists that you need to prevent. Springing up at random points in the story, you only have the opportunity to play through each one once, providing an added element of urgency to what the player could easily brush aside and leave for the endgame. And this not only spices up the formula of the cases, but also really immerses you in the feeling of being a police officer, patrolling the streets, ready to protect the citizens of LA at a moment's notice. They tend to lean more into the fun, parodical elements of the game, and are significantly lighter from a thematic point of view compared to the main game. However, there is one slight issue with them, which is that they usually take place miles away from wherever you're going. More than often, it does feel simpler to just ignore these crimes, instead of taking a detour halfway across the map to do a quick shootout that at the end of the day is completely inconsequential to the game's overarching story or to Cole's character arc. Like I said, they're small pieces of content, and sometimes they do feel like a waste of time, but as the only true side missions in the game, they are without a doubt better than nothing. Reaching the Black's house and talking with his wife, things begin to feel a little off, and that's compounded after you look around. Separate bedrooms, separate pictures, a note from someone named Nicole, a train ticket, a suitcase disappeared, and it's around here, after you figure out that the steel pipe that was found at the crime scene came from Adrian's house, where you can really piece this case together. Adrian, clearly hugely unhappy with his marriage, never had the balls to divorce his wife, and she, well, was too scared to do the same. They could have lived in a sordid misery together forever, if it weren't for Adrian finally having enough and deciding he needed a way out. But instead of just leaving, this man faked his own death by murdering a live hog and smearing his car with its blood. And luckily enough, before he can leave the city, Cole and Bukowski are able to track him down thanks to a tip from Frank Morgan, and Black gets put away for fraud and obstruction of justice. And to me, this was the perfect case to start the desk with. The first non-tutorial case could have easily been a simple cut and dry hit and run, or a basic mugging gone wrong, but instead of smoothly transitioning the player into detective work, Team Bondi created this subversive storyline to shock the player and remind them of that dreaded line that Big says at the start: not everything is as it seems. It really ensures the player stays alert and aware for the rest of the game, as at any moment it seems a case could completely flip on its head. With Adrian away though, Cole and Bukowski get shining praise from the captain, and with that, L.A. Noire moves on to its first DLC case. Originally built as pure pre-order bonuses, over the years the DLC cases of L.A. Noire have become available in various ways, specifically in the complete edition of the game that released back in 2011 and the remaster Rockstar published in 2017. And although there was some annoyance that these cases couldn't be bought individually, the general consensus was that these cases weren't 100% necessary to get the full experience of L.A. Noire. Usually, these cases did little to advance the overarching story of the game, and instead focused more on delving into parts of the period that were left unexplored in the main story. And that's exactly the case with both the console's car and A Slip of the Tongue, which bring to light the sleazy and shady business dealings of the booming motor industry post-World War II. In the first, Cole investigates the theft of a vehicle from the Argentinian embassy, left without tires in the middle of a suburban neighborhood. After some digging, it's revealed that said car was sold to the embassy thanks to a bribe to Juan Francisco Valdez, an Argentinian consul general, who not only is corrupt in a political sense, but also in a moral sense, after it's revealed the man's a pedophile who preys on the working class Latino boys of LA.
You fuck young boys, Valdez.
Are you a madman?
And thanks to this revelation, being forced to apprehend the young Latino garage worker who stole the car, Gabriel Delgado, then becomes yet another ethical quandary. But after a quality car chase through the LA River, you're able to put both the thief and the consul in front of a judge. Unfortunately though, the powerful tend to have a way to wriggle out of such situations, while Gabriel's left alone to be locked up for 5 to 10 years, without his wife or his soon-to-be child. The second traffic DLC case, A Slip of the Tongue, is more focused on the car industry itself, and the dodgy business deals that embody the average sleazy car salesman's life. After being sent to track down a stolen vehicle, Cole and Bukowski swiftly find the supposed thief. However, the guy in question has legitimate ownership papers, along with about 3 other people across LA. Turns out, the stolen car in question has been sold to a car dealership, before it was sold on to the suspect. And so we go down a rabbit hole, uncovering a statewide auto theft ring, before revealing the man running the operation was the owner of a printing shop who was in deep gambling debts that could lose him government contracts. The latter of the cases really delves into the seediness that can seep into legitimate business as soon as extra cash is involved, from the car salesman, the printing shop owner, or even the woman that risked destroying the whole operation to make a quick payday. These 2 DLC cases, along with the others across the game, take more of a look at the average day-to-day life of a police officer, not focusing on any mass conspiracies, but instead delving deeper into the underworld of LA, and the small-time criminals that smatter the city. And whilst these smaller scale crimes have some interesting concepts and are definitely fun, they are nothing compared to the final case of the traffic desk. Before we can get to that grand finale though, Cole makes a quick pit stop at a hit and run case at a bar in Hollywood. One Lester Pattinson was flattened in the late hours of the night, and it's up to Cole and Bukowski to find the person that left him for dead. But after just a few minutes of digging around the crime scene, things start to feel slightly off. It's revealed that Lester had recently taken out life insurance with a payout of $16,000, and on top of that, his marriage was on the ropes. His wife Lorna had apparently seen her husband get hit by the car, but had immediately scampered off home. And tracking her down, you find that this seemingly grieving widow is sitting back relaxed with the bar owner Leroy Sabo. And especially if you found the knife in the alleyway of the bar, things begin to piece themselves together. Leroy and Lorna had colluded to run away together, along with the $16,000 they get after Lester died. Or should I say, after they killed him. And they probably could have got away with this remorseless attempt at insurance fraud, had they not been so sloppy.
Oh, they're whispering in my ear, telling me how we had to get rid of him, how good it could be, all the money we could claim, all that planning, how to get him into the street, how to make it look like an accident.
For God's sake,
you had
Leroy,
all
shut
the
up!
bases covered, baby.
I have nothing to do
you
with it.
You think I'm gonna fry for you,
He's
Lorna?
a crazy man. Shoot him! Shoot him, for God's sake!
The entire traffic desk sprinkles hints of what's to come in later chapters, and this case is no different, as we get our first taste of greed-inspired insurance fraud that ends in people's lives being taken. But of course, once again, we'll get to the rest of that much later. Because first, Cole has to take on easily the most ethically and morally challenging case he's faced thus far. It's here that finally we get an insight into arguably the most morally bankrupt industry in the whole of LA. Hollywood. After actress June Ballard and her protege Jessica Hamilton are drugged and sent over a cliff with a car, Cole's sent to figure out who attempted this murder. Unfortunately for both him and the culprit though, June Ballard is married to notorious gangster Guy McAfee, who wants justice for his wife just as much as the LAPD do. Of course, despite dealing with horrendous people, the LAPD do have a duty of care for both the victims of crimes and the perpetrators, and so Phelps and Bukowski have a duty to find the man behind the crime, Mark Bishop, before McAfee's goons do. But to be honest, it doesn't take very long for the game to convince the player that Mark Bishop would be far better off dead. Going to the receiving hospital, Cole gets a chance to talk to the runaway teenage girl that was at Ballard's side, a 15-year-old girl from Kansas who abandoned home with dreams of her name in lights. But what she got in return for having those dreams was revolting middle-aged men taking advantage of this starry-eyed girl. Mark Bishop, as well as Marlon Hopgood, the owner of a prop house and casting studio, abused Jessica, with the classic idea of the Hollywood casting couch being introduced to the game in the most sickening way imaginable. Being forced to defend a child rapist is hard enough in itself, but when you meet the child in question, it becomes infinitely harder to not want to throw him to the sharks desperately trying to kill him. It turns out that Hopgood and June Ballard were attempting to use the video of Jessica's abuse to blackmail Mark Bishop into giving June a role in his newest film, but before Cole can get a full confession from Marlon, Roy Earl walks in, the living embodiment of the filth that this case is covered in. Roy instantly defends Hopgood as a vice informant, despite the man's known abuse of children, and urges Phelps and Bukowski to leave the studio, where they're left to get to Bishop before McAfee's men execute him. Here we find another newspaper, and with it another cutscene with Courtney Sheldon, who it's revealed was responsible, at least in part, for a major robbery of army-issue morphine after the end of World War II. Trying to get the dope off his hands, he goes to the kingpin of drugs in LA, Mickey Cohen, but after Mickey lowballs him, Sheldon is swift to stand the mob boss up, which, let's just say, Cohen doesn't take too kindly to.
The Sheldon kid? I think I want him dead.
Cutting back to the case, Cole and Stefan follow Bishop's trail to the Jungle Drums movie set, the perfect backdrop for the climax of this cinema-inspired case. After chasing Bishop up the set, you need to get him down and out, fighting your way through a pack of rabid mafia goons in one of the better gunfights throughout the entire game. And after dealing with the mafia and sending Bishop off to his imprisonment, there's an aura of closure in the air, as the captain promotes Phelps to the Homicide Division and leaves Roy Earl to buy a drink for his successful compatriots. And here, we not only get a peek into Roy's evil behaviour, but also see inklings of the true makeup of Cole's character, which up to this point is relatively unclear. Reaching the Blue Room, it takes only a few seconds for Earl to let his rampant racism come to life, and less than 2 minutes later, he does this.
Sorry about this, Cole. What an evening I'm having. First a Negro puts his hands on me, and then this. Who do you think you're talking to, you German junkie whore? Don't you ever forget your place with me again. Do you hear me? Evening, Doc.
Here we also get foreshadowing of the construction conspiracy that comes later on, with Dr. Fontaine present with Elsa as she grieves the death of her friend at the hands of a collapsed new building. Despite its distasteful tone, this scene is one of the best in the entirety of LA Noire, perfectly demonstrating the power Roy has over the people of LA thanks to his status in the LAPD. And on top of that, displaying the disingenuousness of Cole's upright Boy Scout act, after he does nothing and says nothing to stop Roy's racist, sexist, generally horrendous power trip. But then again, no one else does anything either, because it seems this is just the way things are. Standing far and away as the best case on the traffic desk, The Fallen Idol embraces the shady roots of Hollywood, never shying away from the most disturbing topics and giving a real insight into the already established grimy underworld of the city. And that's what the entire traffic desk does best. It establishes that the undercurrent of crime and immorality in LA runs far deeper than anyone realizes. It transitions the player from the clear-cut crimes of patrol to the subversive, morally grey cases that Phelps has to face more and more as the game goes on. By this point, every single plot thread that's been started is still shrouded in mystery, whether it be the construction conspiracy, the morphine heist, the Black Dahlia killer that's been teased. Even Cole's motivations aren't entirely transparent to the player, leading the rest of LA Noire to be one massive uncovering of the truth. Cole's glorious promotion to homicide begins with a woman being beaten to death. Yeah, that pretty much sums up the entire second act of this game. The Homicide Desk in LA Noire is probably the most memorable section of the game, but at the same time, it's probably the least important part of its overarching story. Instead of jumping straight into the conspiracies and redemption arcs, the game takes its time, building on the foundation of the previous 2 chapters laid to give the plot space to breathe. Partnered up with Rusty Galloway, a jaded veteran of the LAPD, Cole immediately comes to ideological heads with the former divorcee. Rusty, after living through 2 world wars and plenty of disasters in between, has clearly let his police work slip as he's developed a simplistic, pessimistic view of the world he occupies, on top of a slight bit of alcoholism. Whereas Cole, as we've come to know, always lets shine a facade of hopeful optimism, a belief in truth, justice, and the American way. That being said, Rusty is by no means a poor detective. Although he's built a fair list of bad habits on the job over the years, it's clear he's got a reputation that precedes him. After all, how could anyone be a top LAPD detective for nearly 3 decades? It's because of this that over the cases, despite their differences in approach, Rusty and Cole develop a great amount of respect for each other, as well as a genuine friendship, one that most people wouldn't expect, all things considered. Speaking of the cases, it's time to talk about murder. The first homicide case Cole faces, like all the ones to follow, begins with a woman, beaten to death and left in the street, stripped naked and covered in messages written in lipstick. However, before we can even get to the body, we run into the vultures of the City of Angels, the media. Many of the themes of this desk revolve around how the media report and profit off these horrifying murders, and we get just a taste of that here, with reporters immediately comparing this case to the fabled Black Dahlia, the real-life murder of waitress Elizabeth Short. Using this infamous historical case, this notoriously unsolved murder to bounce off of, was an absolutely flawless way for Team Bondi to construct a plot thread to run through Homicide. Real quick though, this next session gets a bit graphic, so if you want to skip that, go to this timestamp. On January the 15th, 1947, Elizabeth Short's body was found by a mother and her daughter, mutilated in countless horrifying ways, with several slices covering her body, a Glasgow smile being cut into her face, and the body itself being cut in 2 from the waist down, being drained of blood and placed neatly with her intestines underneath her legs. It was because of this specifically barbaric and cruel treatment of Elizabeth after her death that the media latched onto the case, seeing the beaten and mutilated Elizabeth as an opportunity for a boost in newspaper sales. In fact, a reporter from the Los Angeles Examiner, William Randolph, contacted Short's mother after her body was identified, and instead of informing her of her daughter's tragic passing, he told the mother that Elizabeth had won a beauty contest, and after prying as much personal information as he could from the woman, only then informed her of his lie, and explained that her daughter had been murdered. As disgusting and unempathetic as this was, it was only the beginning, with the Examiner and the Herald, as well as plenty of other newspapers, going on to sensationalize the murder as much as possible. They reported that Short was wearing a tight skirt and a sheer blouse on the night of her killing, trying to paint the murderer out to be a sex fiend, and essentially blaming Elizabeth for her own murder, despite her actually last being seen wearing a tailored suit. They'd go on to nickname Elizabeth the Black Dahlia, and would describe her as an adventurous girl who prowled the streets of Hollywood at night, doing everything they could to make her out to be some kind of call girl. After the real-life case was made famous thanks to newspapers and media coverage, the still unknown killer seemed to get a taste for notoriety, mailing in a package to the LAPD with a note made up of newspaper clippings, as well as a box full of Elizabeth Short's belongings, from her birth certificate, her business cards, photos of the woman, and her address book, all coated in gasoline, similarly to her body. And this, unsurprisingly, just drove the media into an even greater frenzy. They'd go on to completely make up stories about how Elizabeth was tortured for hours. They'd release details of her personal life. They began speculating that she was a lesbian and began interviewing those in her inner circle. I'd imagine I don't really have to explain why this was a completely despicable and revolting response from the press. And LA Noire makes that response a central theme throughout the entire Homicide Desk. After a few months, the entire case went cold, and according to Detective Finis Brown, that was largely due to the press's dominating involvement in the murder. Thanks to the fame the media garnered for the murder, countless false suspects came out of the woodwork, most likely for a brief taste of fame and glory. Whether it was offering the relative as the killer or confessing to the murder themselves, hundreds of average citizens came forward and in many ways obstructed the case, all thanks to the press's coverage. Over the years, there's been plenty of suspects that have popped up, as well as a number of cases that are thought to be possibly connected to the Black Dahlia. The most notable one, though, came only a month after the death of Elizabeth Short, after Jean French was found murdered once again in Los Angeles, stripped nude, badly beaten, with a message written in lipstick on her body. And with that, we come back to L.A. Noire, which replicates this exact case, albeit with Jean French being replaced with another, thus far unidentified woman. Slain and laid out in a park with a ring ripped off her finger and the same message written on her body, understandably leads Cole to presume this is the Black Dahlia killer's return, but Rusty immediately shuts him down. Being in the job for as long as he has, he's learned to see patterns, see simple explanations for seemingly complex murders, whether it's his consistent assumption that if a woman dies it was her husband, or in this case the presumption that this is a mere copycat killer created by the publicity of the original murder. And as the rookie on the case, Cole has no choice but to go along with it, following the leads he has and casting ideas of the two cases being linked from his mind, although it's clear he's not entirely convinced of Rusty's theory, coming up with some ideas of his own.
What's more likely? The werewolf comes back around, leaving us unknown in a corpse?
He clearly has a thing for power. Power over women. Why not power over the police department as well?
Let me finish, fellas. A guy opens his mouth again after 6 months of stewing. Or some opportunist who's been reading about the BD figures he'll rip off the MO and get himself a freebie.
First things first, we check out the only lead we have, the Bamba Club, after finding a mysterious table lighter at the crime scene. After getting the name of the victim, Celine Henry, from the temporary bartender working at the club, he leads us to the bar's owner, who was close with her and her husband Jacob. The owner reveals that Celine left the club late with a mysterious man, but luckily he got the dude's license plate, one Alonso Mendez. But of course, before we check Mendez out, Rusty thinks it's best that we have a look at the husband. At a quick stop at Celine's house, we find yet another newspaper, this time revealing Dr. Fontaine's seedy dealings with his patients, specifically the patient Courtney asked him to help. It was swiftly clear that Fontaine wasn't all that he appeared, but it's implicated here that he's going as far as manipulating the specific patient into burning down houses, for what reasons, still unclear. Back to Cole, and Celine's neighbour gives us a bit of compromising information about her husband. So following trusty Rusty, it's time to go see Jacob Henry, and also unjustly beat the shit out of him. Surprisingly though, after an interview, it seems Galloway was spot on his entire time with his theory. Jacob's had a history of abuse, clearly has a distaste for his wife, and has essentially no alibi. However, there is still one other lead to check out, and any good detective should be thorough. So heading north, we reach Mendez's apartment, where we find everything we could possibly need. A blood-spattered lug wrench, used lipstick, a shoe that matches the prints found at the crime scene, all nicely laid out in Alonso's bedroom, right next to a wide open window. Pretty convenient if you ask me. An easy conviction isn't a half bad way to start Phelps' homicide career, and with the newspapers off the LAPD's back, hopefully this entire Black Dahlia ordeal is over and done with. So Cole decides it's time for celebration, and heads back to the Blue Room to have a drink, alone, watching Elsa sing. But of course, it's time to get back to work. Another day and another dead woman, beaten, strangled and stripped naked and missing plenty of jewelry. This time it's Deirdre Moeller, a supposed party girl with a less than pleasant husband. At least that's what we get after Cole ruthlessly interrogates her 13-year-old fucking daughter.
I think your father was violent with your mother. I think they weren't very happy. You're feeling guilty about this, Michelle. What were you up to that you missed your mother?
You're rotten. I feel terrible already about my mom, and you're trying to make me feel worse.
This man Phelps does not hold back at all. After Hugo, Deirdre's husband, gets home, he gets hostile quick, with a complete lack of an alibi and a history of violence against his wife. And only a few seconds after leaving the man's house, we find some damning evidence that finally points to Rusty's razor being the right theory. Size 8 shoes, stained in blood, being incinerated by the abusive husband. Once again, the evidence is all there. And after you find the man's car at the crime scene with a conveniently placed bloody tire iron in the trunk, this case looks cut and dry. But once again, it's not that simple. L.A. Noire never is. Because when you find Hugo's car in the parking lot of his daughter's school, you also run into one Eli Rooney, a grimy middle-aged man creeping on the young students of the high school. It's clear from the moment you speak to Rooney that he's a vile and potentially dangerous man, and that's not even counting the paedophilia. And after Cole asks Rooney to turn out his pockets to reveal Deirdre Muller's missing butterfly brooch, you might just have enough evidence to have Rooney convicted. The only thing is, it doesn't really seem like Rooney killed Muller. It's clear Cole doesn't think so, and if the player pays any attention to the evidence, they wouldn't think so either. And it's here that L.A. Noire creates a fantastic moral dilemma for the player to go through. Captain Donnelly, as well as Rusty and seemingly the entire police department, want to see Rooney off the streets. He's a dangerous man with evil intentions in his heart, and it would probably make all the daughters of LA safer if he was locked up. However, Hugo has a mountain of evidence against him. He has motive, he has no alibi, and he was found destroying evidence. That being said, he also has a daughter we spoke to, a daughter that's lost her mother and would have nowhere to go should her dad be sent to prison. So, what do? Are you willing to charge a man for a crime he didn't commit just to prevent a possible future crime he might commit? Or do you lock up the man who seems guilty from all angles, leaving his helpless daughter an estranged orphan? What initially appears as a clear-cut case suddenly becomes a question of ethics and a subtle critique of the political factors of the US justice system. And although your choice doesn't have any genuine long-term consequences, it without a doubt makes an impact on Cole and the player in the moment, and just reaffirms the police's willingness to bend the rules of justice for the sake of fixing a wider issue. And whether or not that willingness is ethical is completely up to you. But before you can ponder this philosophical question for too long, Cole sent on another journey across town to investigate the death of yet another woman, this time left naked in an alleyway, curiously enough with a trail of blood spatter through the buildings of downtown LA. Following the trail, it's revealed that the woman goes by Antonia Maldonado, and along the trail you find various personal items that belong to her, from her shoe to her hat to an apartment key that's strung up, as Cole puts it,
strung up like bait on a hook.
I could do an in-depth analysis of this key being strung up like bait on a hook, but I'm just going to assume that you get the visual metaphor. By this point, the thought creeps back into the player's mind that this can't just be a coincidence.
The best way to get away with murder is to pin it on somebody else. I'll bet a month's salary this is a copycat.
Strangled, battered,
Yeah, we know the MO. So does every jerk who kills his wife and girlfriend looking for a way out.
These murders have been too consistent to just be copycats, and if that's the case, this trail gives the impression that the killer himself is getting impatient, almost as if he wants to be caught. This is solidified by the time you get to the end of the trail, a rooftop overlooking the just-picked fruit market. Instead of checking out the market though, Cole and Rusty head over to Antonia's home, a boarding house run by an old southern woman who Cole, says this to.
A nosy old hag like you knows everything about the people who live under her roof.
The two head up to Antonia's room to see it's been broken into, just like Celine Henry's house, and things begin to fall into place. After the window was smashed with a mysterious iron picket, whoever broke in took Antonia's jewellery, but that's glossed over after Cole finds Antonia's divorce papers, made out to her husband Angel, and of course, Rusty comes in with his theories straight away. Heading to Angel's apartment, the man seems genuinely distraught to hear his soon-to-be ex-wife is dead, and after a little digging, it becomes pretty clear that he's either a fantastic liar or simply not the killer, leaving Cole with not a whole lot to go on aside from an address. The El Dorado Bar. Before we can go to the bar though, him and Rusty are first called back to the station, where a new letter's arrived from the Black Dahlia killer, and just like in real life, it's coated in gasoline and made up of newspaper clippings. This time though, there's an extra note attached, an excerpt from Prometheus Unbound, a play written by Percy Shelley. As Cole notes, Prometheus was a titan who superseded the restrictions of humanity, and it's made clear again that not only is the killer impatient with the LAPD, he's also laughing at them, poking fun at their inability to catch him. A god complex, a superiority complex. They wouldn't exactly be unsurprising traits to be found in a man who beats and mutilates intoxicated women. And so, the trail for the true Dahlia killer is, at least to an extent, slightly warmer. Reaching the El Dorado Bar, we meet Carl from How I Met Your Mother, and he tells us that him and the temp bartender he was working with last night saw Antonio, drunk out of her mind. At the end of the night, she wanted a cab, but his phone was out of order, so he sent her across the street to, you guessed it, the Just Picked Fruit Market, a store that's quickly revealed to sell a lot more than just fruit. But aside from the mountain of liquor in the back room, there's something else hiding away in the corner. That's right, once again, Cole finds some conveniently placed evidence, this time laying right in front of where the blood trail from earlier trail led him. A scalpel, a tire iron, a bloodied shirt, and of course Antonia's jewellery box is more than enough to get the owner of the store, Clem Feeney, charged and convicted. Although this time, even more than before, something doesn't feel quite right. Why would he leave a trail of blood right back to his own market? Why would Antonia's apartment be broken into? And why would he, like all the other suspects, keep all the evidence so close at hand? Like Cole says, it all seems far too perfect, but once again, Rusty dismisses him, claiming there is nothing that could be too perfect. After another flashback to the war in which we see Cole being disrespected and disliked by his troops, we move to the 5th victim of the Black Dahlia killer, whose involvement in these deaths is hard for even Rusty to deny, with another body being added to the pile. This time it's one Teresa Tarleton, a woman that for whatever reason was spared the indecency of being stripped naked. Only a couple of minutes into searching the familiar crime scene, a car pulls up with a supposed witness coming forward with some evidence, claiming that a tall disfigured hobo was seen in the area the night of Teresa's death, a man who leads a gang of hobos in the area. Blatant classism aside, this at least provides a lead to go on, but Rusty, unsurprisingly, thinks the husband's the best bet. And so we get the pleasure of going to meet Lawrence Tarleton, a man without an alibi but with access to the triple braid rope that both Teresa and the previous victims were strangled with. That being said, Lawrence doesn't really come across as the killing type, and so instead Cole and Biggs head to Teresa's favourite bar to get a gauge on the company she kept when she was drinking, who according to the bartender was one man in particular, a sailor that she left the bar with in a cab, a sailor named James Jessup, who also happened to turn himself into the police station for questioning. Clearly knowing he'd be a suspect, Jessup clears up the last few hours of Teresa's life, how the two got on a bus and got off at completely different stops, and after checking the bus depot, his story clears out. And so, after chasing all those dead ends, we end up going after the first lead this case gave us, the eyewitness account of the disfigured hobo, and arriving at the man's camp, it's clear Cole and Rusty aren't exactly welcome. After a swift fistfight with the hobo, Stuart Ackerman, we get a peek into his hut to find yet another set of conveniently placed evidence that's easily enough to put a charge on him. Teresa Tarleton's purse, as well as a bloodied triple braid rope. On top of that, we get another newspaper, and this time we get our first look at Jack Kelso post-World War II, now working for an insurance firm. Courtney and Jack worked the same division in the war, and now Sheldon's come to ask a favour. Unable to get the morphine off his hands or off the streets, Courtney begs Jack to help him deal with Mickey Cohen, before Cohen and his mob kill more innocent people with the army surplus drugs. Jack initially refuses, but we immediately see a glimmer in his eye, an urge to help, despite having no involvement in the robbery itself. And so, Kelso starts to come up with a plan to negotiate with Cohen, at least enough to prevent his war comrades from being murdered in a gang war. Cutting back to the precinct, it seems there's only one true suspect for this case, and interviewing Ackerman, the former flamethrower officer in the war, the case against him gets even stronger, with him near confessing to Teresa Tarleton's murder.
How much did you hate Mrs. Tarleton?
I ache to put my seed in them. Afterwards, I have no use for them.
Finally, it seems like we might have got the right killer, but once again, things feel slightly too convenient.
And now my heart's a blazing ruin. You say that you were only fooling.
Closing in on the end of the homicide desk, Cole and Rusty are sent to a train yard to inspect yet another beaten and bloodied woman, but what they find is even more disturbing. Nelson Gaines, a worker at the train yard, found the body along with a man near the crime scene named Jameson. And although it's easy to presume Jameson killed the poor woman, it turns out he was actually, well...
Are you sure you won't be upset?
Try me, Ferdinand.
I was kissing her.
Necrophilia aside, the crime scene provides a decent amount of information on the suspect. The top half of a letter from her family, a bar matchbook, a receipt from a liquor store, and her name, Evelyn Summers. It's also revealed thanks to her smell that Evelyn has been sleeping rough, an alcoholic without a place to go. Well, that's not entirely true. She did have one place. Heading to the liquor store, we find the owners kept a space for Evelyn to stay, a makeshift room in the back, after she got divorced from her husband. There we find an Aristotle book belonging to Grosvenor McCaffrey, as well as a bowling pin of all things, a strange collection of personal items for an alcoholic without a home. Heading over to the bar mentioned earlier, we quickly find McCaffrey reading in a bar at 11 AM, clearly without much else to do in his life. Grosvenor is a revolutionary, a socialist the likes of which weren't exactly popular in the 1940s, and he gives off a sneering vibe of satisfaction over Evelyn's death. She seemed to idolise him and his revolutionary ideas, but the feelings clearly weren't mutual. That being said, he does tell Cole that he saw Evelyn go into a hotel with a mysterious figure named Tiernan. Before we can investigate that lead though, Captain Donnelly calls Cole and Rusty back to the station to inform them that seemingly for the first time ever, himself and the rest of the police department are starting to doubt their theories of copycat killers, finally beginning to look at these cases as being connected instead of digging their heels in and continuing their denial. Regardless of the captain's change of heart though, he still recommends Cole continue to investigate the Summers case as per usual, as to not arise any media suspicion, and so he heads over to the bowling alley to follow up on that strange lead. On the way, Cole poses a question to Rusty. Would he be bothered if he put the wrong person away? And Rusty answers in the most Rusty way imaginable.
Depends.
On what?
On whether anyone except the poor son of a bitch in the slammer ever found out.
Talking to the clerk at the alley, it's revealed that one James Tiernan, a pin setter, had an older female friend that he introduced her to. After a not so quick car chase, Tiernan gives in and he's sent off to the station. But before we can interrogate him, Cole thinks it's best to check out McCaffrey's apartment. And what else do we find but yet another room of conveniently placed evidence? A bloodied shirt, a bloody tire iron, and the second half of the torn letter we found at the start, all conveniently placed on his living room floor. One more chase and we have two suspects ready to be charged for a murder that at this point we know they probably didn't commit. That being said, the case against Grosvenor is pretty strong, as he spends his interview going on and on about how much he despised Evelyn, giving more than enough motive to kill her, and without any alibi.
How is a man supposed to call himself a man?
And Evelyn Summers, a poor, drunken nobody, stole your book.
And she got what was coming to her!
Meanwhile, it's clear that Tiernan's just some meek-mannered kid who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Once again, we put down a charge and close the case, but more so than any other, it's clear now that we've got the wrong guy. In all honesty though, this is easily the worst case of homicide. It feels majorly tacked on to flesh out the game, and other than a couple of car conversations and the captain's change of heart, it does little in the way of pushing the overarching story, and does even less as an interesting mystery in its own right. However, that is all made up for in the final case of Homicide, the Quarter Moon Murders. Arguably the reason Homicide is the most well-remembered section of LA Noire is this last case, a poetic recounting of all the brutal murders we've witnessed so far, one final bounty hunt, one final attempt from the killer to prove his superiority over the police and the city itself, one final showdown that utilizes the whole of LA to its advantage. And it all begins with the Dahlia culprit sending in two more letters, one a basic message taped together with paper clippings, the other a Shelley excerpt, and whilst this panics Rusty and the captain at first, Phelps starts to work things out, starting the maniac's treasure hunt off at Pershing Square, where he finds, lo and behold, Elizabeth Short's social security number, along with another excerpt. Instead of Cole working it out though, it's up to the player to analyse the mysteriously poetic clue, a facet of this case which is both a blessing and a curse. Each of the excerpts you find lead to another of the numerous notable locations scattered around Los Angeles. However, if you've not done enough exploration of the world up to this point, you're kind of left to, well, look up a walkthrough online to figure out where to go. Given, if you don't find the next location within a certain time, Cole will eventually automatically figure it out and set a map marker, but this in itself kind of takes away from the entire point of the case, turning it into literally just a series of driving from A to B. To be fair though, at each location you reach, there is a mini set piece to spice things up. First, the Hall of Records, where after finding Deirdre Muller's missing watch, the chandelier collapses under Cole's feet. Next, you precariously climb the LA Public Library to find Antonio Maldonado's medallion. Following a long drive, you wade through Westlake tar pits to find Teresa Tarleton's shoe, and then you traverse a hedge maze to uncover Celine Henry's lost ring. And as the sun goes down, you finally reach the abandoned movie set from the Mark Bishop case that capped off the traffic desk. And after a climb to find Evelyn Summers' missing ring, as well as the 7th and final excerpt, you have to escape before the movie set collapses. The number 7 itself has a great deal of symbolic significance here. The 7th excerpt, the 7th location. Perhaps this treasure hunt around the landmarks of LA was in reference to the 7 wonders of the world, or maybe there's a more religious meaning. 7 is a number that's been connected to religion and myths since seemingly the start of organized religion itself. Whether it be the Quran speaking of 7 heavens, the newborn Buddha rising and taking 7 steps, the Hindu belief in 7 separate overworlds and 7 underworlds, or maybe most prominently the 7th day in the book of Genesis, the day in which God took his rest after creating the heavens heavens and the earth, creating the animal kingdom, creating humanity itself. After all, the Dahlia Killer has compared himself to a god once before in his letters to the LAPD, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that this 7th excerpt, and with it this entire bounty hunt, is him attempting to rest, him finally allowing himself to be caught by the LAPD so that he can finally end his killing spree and be at peace. Well, he couldn't have chosen a more thematically appropriate spot to take his rest. Reaching the Christ Crown of Thorns church, a few blocks away from the movie set, Cole and Rusty step out of the car onto the dark, rainy street, overlooking the place of worship. And as the player walks towards the front door, so many things begin to click together. Inspecting the fence, you can see it's lined with the same iron pickets used to break into Antonia Maldonado's bedroom. You remember what the coroner told you about the triple braid rope used to strangle the victims that is commonly found on church bells. And as you come closer to uncovering the Black Dahlia Killer, the images of all his victims spring back into your mind. Elizabeth Short, Celine Henry, Antonia Maldonado, Deirdre Moeller, Teresa Tarleton, Evelyn Summers. And as Cole opens the door to the towering church, you're finally greeted with the maniac behind this horrifying killing spree.
Keep your hands where I can see them, or I'll be forced to redecorate the stucco with your entrails.
Does the face ring a bell? No? Well, let me rewind real quick.
Gentlemen, what can I get you?
Phelps and Galloway, LAPD. Were you working here last night?
Yes. How can I help, officer?
You can start with your name.
Garrett Mason.
You're the regular bartender on nights?
I'm a temporary barman. I work for an agency. I fill in at bars across town.
That's right, the murderer this whole time was the very first person of interest we spoke to in our very first homicide case. The temporary bartender from the Bamba Club, Garrett Mason. It all makes sense. This man, this murderer, went from bar to bar, finding these drunk, down on their luck women to beat to death, and since his jobs were only temporary, he was gone by the time anyone came to investigate.
You worked the bar last night?
Yeah. Me and a temp guy from the agency.
Close to a perfect crime, from a man the likes of which you wouldn't expect to have a god complex fueled bloodthirst for an inebriated woman. Mason escapes down the catacombs, and so Cole and Rusty rush to the side house to find another way down, but as they do, they find Mason's lair, covered in the blood of his victims, a bathtub full of blood, a blood-spattered iron wrench, and maybe most repulsive of all, bloodied scalpels, most likely used to dissect Elizabeth Short after her death. Descending into the catacombs, into the underworld of LA, into the depths of hell, Cole's met with shotgun fire, along with a psychological analysis of himself from Garrett Mason. Mason observes that Cole's an interesting man, a man overqualified for the LAPD. So why oh why would a college-educated war hero choose to hunt down criminals in alleyways and sewers? Is Cole attracted to the power his position gives him, or is it something else? Retribution maybe? Redemption for Cole's own list of sins? Well, before we can get an answer, Mason's taunting comes to an end, along with his slaughterous activities. And for a moment, the player finally has a swelling feeling of accomplishment at their long-awaited prosecution of the monster truly responsible for all these murders. However, this moment is washed over quickly, as we're met by Captain Donnelly back at the church, and the second we don't see his usual gruff cheeriness, it's clear that something's wrong. Once again, the politics, the corruption of those in power get in the way of true justice. The captain reveals that Garrett Mason was the half-brother of an exceptionally high-up governmental figure, which finally explains the man's god complex. Mason, a mere temporary bartender, clearly had some issues with feeling inferior to his ultra-successful half-sibling, probably bringing with it a burning desire to prove himself as something more than just a bartender. Or perhaps a lack of aid from his brother led Garrett to feel he needed to get revenge on the system, on the powers that be, by proving he could outsmart them. Whatever his motive, this information does more than just give us a look at the headspace of this serial killer. It also flips the entire case on its head. Homicide, from the moment the desk began, was very focused on the media's involvement with the police and how the media impacted police work as a whole, linking heavily into the real-life death of Elizabeth Short. And once again, the media becomes the wall that prevents the police from being able to publicize this victory. If the news that a government official's brother was the Dahlia Killer got out, it would cause a media frenzy, bringing havoc down upon both the government and the LAPD itself, and so it's decided by the higher powers not to make the capture of Mason official. The case is to be left open, Cole and Rusty are to get no recognition, and the public is to be left believing the Dahlia killer is still out on their streets. As for the men Cole and Rusty charge, Donnelly ensures that it will be simple enough to interfere in their trials, preventing any of those innocent men from being convicted. However, if it's that easy to pardon innocent men, imagine how easy it is to pardon guilty ones. To say the least, it is a bittersweet note to leave Homicide on, and as Cole is promoted once again, the player is left with a far more doubtful and pessimistic perspective on the justice system, and how the politics involved prevent true justice from being achieved, even in getting a mass murderer off the streets. And this dejected feeling that the finale of Homicide leaves us with is the perfect entry into the seedy, unjust world of advice. Cole arrives at Hollywood Police Station, decked out in his new suit, ready to rub shoulders with the rich and famous, and he's immediately greeted by the pig himself, Roy Earl. Apparently, Roy personally sent a special request to have Cole transferred to Advice, clearly taken aback by Phelps' standout police work, and I'm sure, of course, absolutely no ulterior motive whatsoever. But it's soon shown that the only real difference between Homicide and Vice is the cause of death, with Cole and Roy immediately being sent off to investigate the deaths of two jazz musicians, at the hands of military surplus morphine, the stolen morphine that's been hinted at throughout the newspapers up to this point. It takes no time at all though for this case to introduce the underlying themes of this desk: bigotry, disingenuousness, and corruption. Roy explains to Cole the systematic nature of the narcotics industry, the constant stream of supply and demand that keeps mobsters like Mickey Cohen on their feet. And it's clear from this little monologue that Roy doesn't think the system is something that needs to be stopped, but simply kept out of the public eye. The way he looks at it, people are unchangeable, everyone needs to blow off steam, everyone relies on some kind of drug to keep them going, so the role of vice cops is to purely keep it manageable. And in his case, gain as much from the criminal enterprise as he possibly can, whether that's prestige as a detective or under the table cash from the criminals in question. Combine this with his open and avid racist tendencies, and Roy quickly makes a case for being the embodiment of all that's wrong with the world, and more specifically, all of the seedy and underhanded going-ons of LA. And once again, this is all conveyed in just the first few scenes of the desk, reaffirming the game's fantastically layered yet concise writing that's consistently able to hit on themes and convey characterization in nuanced ways. Although in the case of Earl specifically, it's not always so nuanced. It turns out that the musicians in question, Tyrone Lamont and Cornell Tyree, were receiving their army surplus morphine from popcorn cups delivered by the Black Caesar Cafe. Oh, and super helpfully, there's a couple of strange notes scattered around their apartment that become absolutely vital in the case later on. After a quick chase of the vendor at the Black Caesars, along with Roy's undisguised affinity for police brutality, we find a box of morphine in the food truck, along with number slips from Ottie's bookmakers, and a trail back to one Jermaine Jones, who owns a talent agency. The vendor himself, Fleetwood Morgan, is quick to identify Jermaine Jones as the morphine distributor, and after giving Cole and Roy plenty of information, he gets thrown in the back of a police van, with Roy taunting him the entire way. Obviously, Fleetwood was by no means innocent, but the political undercurrents of this image, especially when placed in the context of a segregated America, really strike home and draw parallels with the major racial controversies we see in modern American policing. Heading over to Jones' booking agency, Roy is quick to mention that he saw Cole in the Blue Room recently, and immediately suggests that Cole was there instead of tucked in at home with his wife and kids, thanks to a certain delightful but damaged German girl and her beautiful singing. Phelps, of course, shuts this down quickly, but it's pretty clear that Roy requested Cole to advise for a cause aside from simply his quality detective skills. Reaching the agency, it doesn't take much investigation to find a stash of morphine on top of a massive pile of cash inside a jukebox that Cole was able to open thanks to one of those lucky slips of paper he found at Lamont's apartment earlier. Inside a jukebox that he sees was delivered by Ramez Removals. With Jones on the hot seat, Roy is quick to let him know that he knows a judge that hates black people, because of course he does. And the thought of a near life sentence is just enough to get Jones to let slip what he knows. According to him, his morphine was supplied by one Lenny the Fink, aka Lenny Finkelstein, the half-witted brother of Mickey Cohen. And on top of that, Lenny the Fink is a good friend of the owner of Ramez Removals, and things swiftly begin to become clear. But before pursuing Ramez, Cole needs to rule out his other lead, Merlin Otti, and his illegal gambling ring. Again, when you reach Otti's, those lucky slips of paper from earlier come in handy, as they open up a slot machine once once again delivered by Ramez Removals, and once again filled to the brim with morphine and cash. Otti himself has clearly come across the LAPD before, and immediately offers up a bribe to Cole and Roy, which I'd imagine would probably slide if Phelps wasn't there. But Merlin can't get away that easily, and so after taking him in, it's time to head over to Ramez's warehouse to seemingly put an end to this racket. However, after checking the delivery logs and finding a mysterious ice room in the back filled with morphine solidified in ice blocks, it's clear that the dope's coming from somewhere else. Polar Bear Ice Company, a company that went out of business years ago, but clearly never truly shut down. And it's there at the ice factory that we find Lenny the Fink, surrounded by countless mafia goons, with their guns drawn and at the ready. One brilliantly designed gunfight later, and we find Lenny the Fink, a man who has no interest in going to prison, and so Roy and Cole become judge, jury, and executioner. With a near 100 grand of stolen morphine recaptured, it seems the case of the ship heist is solved, and both Roy and the captain are more than happy with the credit and praise that will come their way, with the captain saying that if Cole's able to keep up this good work, he'll work out just fine in Vice. And with that, this first case seems like a relatively clean-cut one, if only they were all that easy. The first of 2 DLC cases on the Vice desk. Reefer Madness sees Cole and Earl track down 2 members of a marijuana distribution ring thanks to a snitch giving out information in exchange for some cash. It's here that we get a real focus on the war on drugs and the racial biases that came with it, especially when it comes to Latin Americans and their prosecution over the national criminalization of weed in the 1930s. After a shootout with one Juan Garcia Cruz, it's revealed that cannabis throughout the city is being smuggled in tomato soup cans and distributed from there. So the first stop is the local soup factory, a factory run by a slimy businessman who massively profited off the war and the need for frontline rations. After the war, like so many companies, he lost a lot of business, leading him to employ a large amount of illegal immigrants in order to reduce wage costs. It really is just capitalism in its finest form. Speaking to a few of the workers, we're led to the 20th century market, where the owner quickly explains the details of the entire operation. The weed is dropped off at the soup factory at night, packed into the cans and sent off. So back to the factory we go in the dead of night with uniformed cars beside us, ready to raid the operation. After gunning down the distributors, a set of silver dollars collected throughout the case leads us to a metal factory, where we find the true leader of the smuggling campaign, Victor Sanders, an associate of Roy who clearly has more than a few people in the LAPD on his payroll, and although Cole arrests him, it's clear the man won't face charges, thanks to his excessive connections.
Be surprised how things have a habit of sorting themselves out. Evidence disappearing. Witnesses that can't be found.
This is the first case where we see plain-faced corruption in the LAPD, without any subtlety or discretion, and it's disheartening to say the least. After all those small-time distributors and dealers face charges, or worse, face death, the leader of it all, the white dude in the suit and tie, gets off scot-free purely based off his reputation. It's a true testament of things to come, and although the case as a whole doesn't do much for the overall narrative, it reaffirms in the player's mind the corruption of the LAPD. Corruption that we'd swiftly see come to a head in the following case. Before we get there though, we get another flashback to the war, where we see Cole and his friend Hank being ordered to send their unit up Sugarloaf Hill to break the Japanese line of defense despite Cole's meek attempt to get out of it. On top of that, we see the true darkness of war through the eyes of Courtney Sheldon, who Cole sees run up onto the hill to put a wounded soldier out of his misery. The reality of war is that not everyone can make it, and Courtney sees this reality, whereas Cole maintains his righteous facade, but a facade can only last so long. Relatively happy with the outcome of their first 2 cases, Roy and Cole head to the big fight in the middle of town to watch KSI versus Jake, but wait, no, that's not right. Albert Hammond versus... Actually, we never hear the other guy's name.
I got $50 on the black kid.
But unfortunately for Roy, and it seems the entirety of the rest of LA, Hammond wins the fight in a shock upset, leaving him sprinting for his dressing room, chased by his agent and a hefty few people who are owed money, Earl included. Breaking into his dressing room, we see Albert's up and vanished, and Roy's quick to send a search party out after him to prevent him from being killed. The fight, like so many fights, Ben Askren, was fixed. Hammond was meant to take a fall, but either his pride or his plan to make some cash of his own got in the way. Before we start investigating the case though, we find another newspaper and are brought back to the office of Dr. Harlan Fontaine for another one of his many meetings with Courtney Sheldon. Courtney's in a rough state with a mountain of extra morphine on his hands and nowhere to send it, and he discusses his troubles in confidence with Dr. Fontaine, who just so happens to have a seemingly perfect plan to calm Sheldon's worries. He agrees to take the stolen morphine off Courtney's hands to use it in a medical capacity, and to use the money he saves on medicine to invest in new housing developments for returning military veterans, a plan which sounds almost too good to be true, but a plan that Courtney trusts the Doctor will follow through on. Back to the boxing stadium, and Cole finally gets a chance to come face to face with the primo gangster of LA, Mickey Cohen, and after a quick back and forth, Cole drops an absolute banger.
Cole Phelps, Mickey Cohen.
I know who he is, Roy. I met his brother-in-law.
After tracking down Albert Hammond's girlfriend, it becomes abundantly clear that his plan all along was to cash in, betting on himself through her. Here we get the first non-optional tailing mission, a feature honestly underused throughout a lot of LA Noire. Although car tailing is basic, slow and tedious, on-foot tailing is far more interesting, with the NPC AI being far more responsive to your actions than the likes of Assassin's Creed's tailing. However, you can avoid being constantly stopped in your tracks by using the incognito mode, utilising the environment around you to appear like an average citizen. Whether it's reading a paper, visiting a shoe shine, or inspecting shop windows, you can easily blend into the crowds of LA civilians by engaging in the city itself, a small but appreciated feature of a system rarely used. As Hammond's girlfriend Candy picks up her and her boyfriend's winnings from various bookmakers around the town, it's unclear whether she's getting the collections for Hammond or stiffing him and taking them for herself, something that becomes especially unclear after we hear her murdered in the LA bus station. We see a pistol left on the ground and the window left open with the money cleaned out, and immediately Roy assumes it was Hammond, but after tracking the boxer down to the Chinese theatre in Hollywood, it's revealed that Hammond never betrayed his beau. He loved Candy and planned to take her back to England, before Hammond's manager Carlo Arquero found her. And now Carlo's come to finish Albert off, but Cole and Roy arrive at the theatre just in time to take the Italian out. All Hammond wanted was to be able to get out of his life in LA, to get back to England with some semblance of riches carrying him and his love, and that was stripped away from him thanks to the mob. It's clear though that Cole has some respect for the man, and he clearly believes Albert deserves a second chance in life.
Because I was a Marine, and I once lacked courage. Everyone deserves a second chance. Now beat it.
So despite majorly pissing off Roy and the rest of the police department that lost money on the fight, Phelps lets Hammond go scot-free, something that for the first time stains his flawless reputation in the LAPD. Because one thing you should never do is mess with a corrupt man's money. Here we get another flashback to the war, arguably the most important flashback in the entire game, as we finally see how Cole got his Medal of Honor. In the chaos of battle, up on Sugarloaf Hill, Cole and his right-hand man Hank try to push through a barrage of machine gun fire, despite Cole's best efforts to retreat. But Hank reminds Cole that their fellow troops need assistance. He pleads with Cole to stay and help, before suddenly he's hit by a mortar. Right next to Cole, blown into nothingness. Phelps, in shock but without any wounds, immediately freezes, and we see this supposed war hero cower in a bunker, refusing to fire, refusing to retreat, simply hiding from the fight until morning, where he's found by Kelso and his unit. And whilst the troops immediately see through what Phelps did, the high-ranking officer who shows up clearly sees it another way, considering Phelps to be a vital piece in their capture of Sugarloaf Hill and offering him the Silver Star Medal. That's right, this whole time the war accolade Cole's been put on a pedestal because of came from pure cowardice, a lack of courage and a lack of leadership that let his friends and brothers die. And that's not even the end of Cole's dishonourable wartime grievances. The second DLC case of the Vice Desk comes in the form of something we're far more acquainted to thanks to our time on Homicide: murder. That's right, after being reunited with Rusty and newly promoted Bukowski, we get a look into the murder of notorious model and actress Julia Randall. And whilst at first glance this seems like a mere murder via forced overdose, this case blows up into so much more. Not only was Julia the victim of medical malpractice, but she also played a major role in a citywide burglary ring, alongside one Henry Arnett and also her doctor, who it's then revealed was madly in love with Julia. What begins as a simple murder becomes an interweaving web of burglaries across LA, and a tragically uncomfortable one-sided love story about a doctor and the patient he mistreated.
What have I done?
And it all ends exactly how you'd expect, with a massive rooftop gunfight against a fleeing professional wrestler who plays the harmonica. Maybe I haven't exactly explained this case all that well. In my defense, there's a lot of moving parts, and in all honesty, although it's a pretty subversive and interesting case that truly makes the player think, it's also completely meaningless, and after you've completed it, it's literally never mentioned again. So like, yeah, it's good. I don't think most people who've played LA Noire even know this case exists, so yeah, this is super awkward. I don't have a transition.
Who do you think you're talking to, you German junkie whore?
And with that, we reach yet another grand finale, the final case of the Vice Desk, the true end of Noire's second act, and arguably the best case we've come across so far. The Coolridge morphine heist is a narrative thread that's carried throughout the game from the very first hour, and finally we see the many pathways the robbery opened up converge on a mass shooting in a nightclub recently bought by former Marine Eddie McGoldrick. How McGoldrick came into enough money to buy a nightclub, no one seems to know, but it's abundantly clear that Eddie didn't just get some kind of Christmas bonus. No one comes into that much money that quick, cleanly, and considering McGoldrick was on the ship and has a box of army surplus cigarettes and a rack of military machine guns, it's pretty clear where his sudden wealth sprouted up from. Along with the guns and drugs, Cole also finds a fair few clues leading him to the Blue Room, and once again back to Elsa Lichtman, something that Roy isn't exactly overjoyed about, especially considering the first thing that comes out of his mouth when the two cops reach the club.
Since when have the police cared about dead black men?
Good point. We don't. What we care about is 2 tons of army surplus morphine showing up on the street. If you care about working in this town, you better give me something on Biddleston and Bow, or their knucklehead buddies Tyree and Lamont.
And this is your idea of making inquiries, Untersturmführer?
I've told you 1,000 times about speaking that German gibberish at me, Elsa.
Roy! How about you get a drink while I see to this?
After Cole sat idly and watched as Roy beat Elsa at the end of traffic, it's interesting to see the man suddenly step in and stop his antics now. Interesting enough for Roy to definitely take note of Cole's defensive behaviour around the jazz singer. Interviewing Elsa herself, it's clear she has no apprehensions about giving away information on the morphine supplier. After all, like she says, everyone in the town already knows exactly who controls the drugs in LA, Mickey Cohen. Before Cole can go though, Elsa has a private word with him, and for the first time in the game, someone finally questions the value of what Cole's doing directly to his face, something that no one else has either had the confidence or insightfulness to do.
Why do you ask people to risk talking about a subject that could have them jailed?
Drugs are against the law, Elsa.
You're so full of courage, you have never felt ashamed.
This is getting us nowhere.
Do you think you'll win your war against narcotics?
It's not my war. It's against the law. My job is to prosecute the laws of this city.
Do you think you can stop people from needing drugs, detective?
I'm asking the questions here.
Then why do you come to me with your stupid questions? You know who controls the drugs in this city.
It's not enough to just survive, Elsa. You have to try and make the world a better place.
Brave words, and very noble. But words are just words, Cole Phelps.
From this scene and the one that follows, it may seem on the surface that Elsa is a classic femme fatale, a woman set on seducing Phelps with her introspective ideas in order to trap Cole. However, as it does with so many things, Noire takes this trope and flips it on its head, turning Elsa not into some kind of enchantress, but instead into one of the few genuine people in the entire city. Elsa is a tragic story of a woman who survived the Nazi regime, only to move to another country that hated her, a country that took from her the only friend she had, and a country that made her feel like nothing more than a piece of meat. And because of this scarred, traumatic life, she acts as the perfect contrast to Cole, the successful war hero, college graduate, husband, and police officer. Being the first person in the game to be on the same intellectual level as Phelps, she's finally able to open up a new perspective to him, a new perspective on life, on his work, on the nature of humanity as a whole. And it's that, far more than her beauty, that not only seduces Cole, but makes him genuinely fall for Elsa. Fall for her more than he's ever fallen for anyone. Elsa exposes Cole for what he is, a hypocrite, a man dishonest with himself, a man dishonest with the world, a man willingly ignorant and naive to the suffering that life brings, a man in denial of all his past wrongs, and a man who is loyal to the system to a fault. And as all of this is suddenly made clear in Cole's mind, he chooses to do something that at this point the player may never think him capable of doing. He goes to Elsa's apartment that evening, knocks on the door and stays with her, instead of going back home to cuddle up with his wife and kids. The only problem is that a certain man tailed him, a man that specifically requested Cole to be his partner, a man who's been hinting at Cole's vices throughout the entirety of the desk. The player's stomach sinks as the sun goes down and the city of LA fades into darkness, and even as Cole arrives at the Macambo Club the next morning to meet Roy, the feeling of anxiety persists in the player. However, Roy stays quiet, and the two enter the club to finally have a long-awaited chat with Mickey Cohen, who from the moment you ask your first question makes it clear that he has any possible answer rehearsed rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times over. Heading back to the station to investigate the true depth of the Coolidge robbery, Cole and Roy run into an absolute media storm stirring outside the Hollywood police station, with talks of a prostitution scandal covering the headlines of every major newspaper. Cole, though, is of course the golden boy of the department, so he saunters past the media and upstairs to look into the shipping manifest, where he finds the names of countless of his war comrades, all stationed on that ship that was robbed. And when a uniform comes in to tell Cole and Roy that a bus in Hollywood is being shot with an MG, it becomes pretty clear that someone's trying to put the muscle on all the soldiers involved in the heist. After stopping the bus shooting and interviewing former soldier Felix Alvaro, Cole decides it's finally time to reunite with Jack Kelso. Phelps is firm in his belief that Jack had nothing to do with the robbery, so hopefully he can get some info out of his old rival. But despite being clean, Jack has more integrity than to give up his own men for the sake of Cole's rising LAPD reputation. It's clear that Kelso doesn't have an ounce of respect for what Cole's trying to do, and so him and Roy are back to square one, until we get another call and another major shooting. Here we get a similar finale to that of Homicide, but this time instead of finding clues at different LA landmarks, Cole's tasked with preventing mass shootings across the streets of Hollywood, shootings targeting men he knows. First, it's Robert's Diner, where Cole and Roy chase down a couple of mobsters into an alleyway and take them down swiftly. And in the process of searching their bodies, we find yet another newspaper, and our fears from earlier finally come true. We see the mayor, the district attorney, and the police chief having a panicked meeting over the media's controversy of the week. With election season coming in just a year, they can't afford the LAPD being drowned in a prostitution scandal, and whilst they desperately try to come up with some way to avoid disaster, Roy walks in with the perfect solution.
I have a human interest story. It involves a certain LAPD cop, a hero from the war, who has let his beautiful wife and kids down, who has betrayed America for a German junkie whore, who has abandoned his pledge to the LAPD and his commitment to the public we all serve. Could be all over the papers by tomorrow, and you would be off the hook.
Well, fuck. In the meantime, Cole still has to stop these shootings, and after a gunfight at the Hollywood post office, we hear the dying breaths of one Walter Beckett.
Tell Courtney. Bad luck.
Finally, Cole's suspicions are confirmed, and luckily enough, just as we get this confession, we get a call from KGPL, informing Cole that Courtney Sheldon has come straight to the station to request an interview with Phelps, and so it's time to head back to the interview room. Just before Roy and Phelps reach Sheldon though, they're stopped by Captain Donnelly, who takes Earl up to his office and leaves Cole to do the interview himself. Meeting Fontaine and sitting down with Courtney, Cole goes in depth on the robbery, exposing Sheldon's lies at every opportunity and convincing him to give himself up in order to protect the rest of the soldiers involved in the heist. But before Phelps can get a full confession, the police chief walks in, and immediately we know what's going on. Just like in Homicide, Cole finally solves the mystery that the entire Vice desk was leading up to, but the powers that be take it from under his feet, and this time they take everything.
You certainly had us fooled, Detective. Phelps, you're one of my favorite sons. You've broken this old man's heart.
Sir, what is going on?
You're suspended, Phelps. Hand over your badge and gun.
Don't keep him waiting.
What is going on here?
Your wife's attorney has pictures of you and the German. Compromising pictures.
She's pressing charges. You'll be formally charged with adultery. A criminal cannot serve as an LAPD officer, as I'm sure you're aware.
I don't understand. How could you do it, lad? Your wife, your children, consorting with the enemy and a dope fiend at that. You're lucky the war is over. You'll be taken out and shot.
The department doesn't need this kind of publicity, Phelps. Hand over the gun, keep your head down until your board hearing. I forbid you to make any comments to the press.
Cole, after all he's done for the department, catching the Dahlia killer, finding the army surplus morphine, apprehending Lenny the Fink, Mark Bishop, and soon enough Mickey Cohen, after all that, he's given up by the men who were meant to stand by his side. He's torn down by an organization that he truly believed in, that he gave his everything to. He's sold out by his very own partner, despite everything he's done, all so that the higher-ups he serves can stay in their ivory towers, with all the power they need to bend the city to their will. And after his wife throws him out and takes his children away from him, he goes to the only person he knows has faced this kind of exile before, and to the only place that he knows is safe. Being torn down from his gracious glory, Cole is reassigned to the not-so-sunny suburbs of the Wilshire Police Division, sent to the dead end that is the Arson Desk until his fitness review is up. Immediately, we see a changed Cole, a humbled Cole, a Cole that lets his shoulders hunch and his head fall, hiding from the public scrutiny he brought upon himself. Phelps gets partnered up with the man we've not heard from since the opening speech of LA Noire, Herschel Biggs, easily the most underutilized and misunderstood character in this entire game. A weather detective and a World War I veteran, Biggs gained a reputation as a social recluse thanks to his distaste for partners. He's a man with vast life experience, seeing the true depths of humanity and surviving, because that's who Biggs is. He's a survivor. He survived the Great War, and he survived the corruption and cynicism that comes with the LAPD. And he represents what's in the cards for Phelps if he keeps going down the same route he's on. Biggs becomes easily one of the most interesting and introspective characters we meet throughout the entire game, constantly giving us a philosophical perspective on the world around us, despite his surface level pessimism that's led many people to simplify his flawed, layered character down to just being another Rusty. For the first near 10 minutes of this first arson case, Cole and Biggs sit in intensely awkward silence before Biggs laments Phelps for his ego, claiming that Cole would have never given him a second look if it weren't for the fact that his reputation was in ruins. And Cole, for the first time in the game, doesn't give some retort. He doesn't argue. He doesn't try and come off like the good guy. He doesn't defend himself or try and boost himself. He simply stays quiet, knowing for a fact that Biggs is absolutely right, that the man he is, the man he was barely a man at all. More of an ambitious figurehead for the LAPD to rise up and praise for as long as they needed him. A so-called war hero that, as we know at this point, gained a Medal of Honor for failing his troops, for letting his fellow soldiers die as he cowered away. We get all that from just one car conversation. I don't know about you, but I'd say there's a lot more to Biggs than meets the eye. 2 houses, 2 fires, the Steffens family away on a holiday that they won in a prize draw, and the Sawyers, who died tragically in their sleep, despite them supposed to be on the exact same prize vacation. Immediately, Cole sees a connection, but unlike Homicide, unlike Vice, he stays quiet. He can't speak out because he knows he has no legs to stand on anymore. And after all, as everyone keeps telling him, arson is a dead end. You barely get any convictions, and that's if you can even find evidence, which is really driven home by the fact that there's only a single clue in the entire first crime scene you search. Luckily, Cole picks up a couple of leads. First, Gulliver's Travel Agency, and second, InstaHeat, the creator of the boilers responsible for these 2 fires. Reaching the travel agent, it's quickly revealed that the Suburban Redevelopment Fund is creating these promotions that send prize vacations to lucky winners, and the redevelopment fund immediately catches the attention of Cole, but Biggs shies away from it, criticizing Cole for trying to make this case bigger than it actually is, desperately chasing stardom again, craving the hero label he carried for so long. And this is where this case's biggest flaw comes in, because Biggs should have been right. Every time Cole's walked into a desk, he's passed every case with flying colours. He's uncovered conspiracy and serial killers, but here we should have seen an already humbled Cole be brought down to size even more. The first case of arson, at least the first case, should have gone exactly the way Biggs said it would. It should have been a dead-end case with no clues or legitimate suspects, so that Biggs' critique of Cole here was justified. I understand that Team Bondi might have thought that the player would get annoyed by a case that does little in the way of driving the plot forward, but I feel it really would have punctuated Cole's fall from grace. That being said, Biggs' point is still fairly valid, and it leads Cole away from the redevelopment fund and over to the fire station, where the fire chief has a theory he wants to share with Cole. After a quick year 8 chemistry lesson, essentially the chief explains that he believes the boilers could have been purposefully tampered with, and this is confirmed by the manager of InstaHeat, as Cole heads over to gain information of the boilers as well as the employees of the company. One employee in particular jumps out, Matthew Ryan, who after a quick check of his locker is revealed to be an anarcho-communist who wants to change the fabric of the United States. And if you didn't know, communists weren't exactly the most adored people of all time in 1940s America. After picking up 3 suspects, Ryan included, we get some quick interrogations, and it's revealed that Ryan's family was killed in a fire caused by a faulty boiler created by one of InstaHeat's franchisees. With the motive of revenge on top of the motive of corporate interference, it seems pretty cut and dry that Ryan's our man, and to the shock of Biggs and the captain alike, Cole actually gets a result on his first arson case. And although it's clear that no one can truly respect him anymore, Phelps gets at least some credit where it's due for being such a good case man, a tiny bit of silver lining after everything he's gone through. Up to this point, it could be debated whether Cole was genuine in his efforts as an officer of the law, whether he genuinely cared about the city and its people, or whether he was acting so righteous as to gain the glory he's clearly always had an ambition for. But to me, even the fact that Cole still puts effort into his cases, that he still works as a detective, is evidence enough that this man has a genuine passion and care for what he does. He truly believes he's doing the right thing, at least he does for now, and that goes regardless of where he's placed. He'll always be working to redeem himself for what he did all those years ago on that hill in the war. The quiet, reserved man we see in this case, and for the rest of Arson, is so different from the head-held high officer we saw at the start of the game, but despite his facade fading away, he's still the same man, a good man at the end of the day. And it's for this reason that during the Arson Desk, we move away from Cole a bit and get an opportunity to explore the shoes of Jack Kelso. But we'll get to that in a bit, because first we need to meet Leland Monroe. Another day, another fire, as is the life of an arson detective. With the real estate industry booming, it seems more and more housing developments are sprouting up every day, and with them, plenty of fires and accidents that are needing solved. But Biggs and Cole are instead sent to an old neighbourhood, one that the Suburban Redevelopment Fund and Elysian Fields are buying out to demolish and rebuild. Could it be a coincidence that yet another boiler's fire wiped out yet another family unwilling to sell their house to Elysian Fields? Well, Cole doesn't think so. However, this particular case has an added element that makes it seem like far more than a simple bit of corporate fraud. No, whoever burnt down this house seems to have a particular attraction to fires, as shown by the bodies of the victims, the Morelli family, who've been arranged in a prayer position for all the world to see. Immediately, Cole makes a connection to the past cases and reignites his theory that they got the wrong guy, but this pushes Biggs a bit too far. He runs out, sick to his stomach, clearly facing some kind of PTSD from his experience in World War I, as we get more insight into his past and why he became an arson cop in the first place. Before this case can truly even get underway though, we find a newspaper that explains it all. In the very first newspaper cutscene of the game, Courtney asked Dr. Fontaine to take in one of his war buddies, a man who suffered a great deal in the war and clearly needed some psychiatric help. After Fontaine manipulated him into burning down houses though, it's clear the mysterious man was pushed over the edge, fully embracing a life of arson, spouting rants about finally finding the meaning in his life, finding the beauty in the death and destruction his fires bring. Cutting back to Cole, we get some information from a neighbourhood of the Morellis, a flyer revealing that the family won the exact same competition as the Sawyers and Steffens from the previous case, a competition run by Leland Monroe and Elysian Fields as part of the Suburban Redevelopment Fund. But when Cole reports this back to the captain, he's shut down immediately. He's explicitly told not to go after Leland Monroe, and so Phelps and Biggs explore the only lead they have, another house fire a few blocks away at a new GI housing development built by Elysian. After a quick bit of investigation, we see that the house in question was built with mediocre materials, poor cement, undersized bricks, and a lack of wall ties holding the whole thing together. This clearly confirms a theory in Cole's mind, and surprisingly, it convinces Herschel to give in and go after Monroe, reaffirming Biggs' genuine attitude towards his cases, not concerned with the politics involved in the police department and its higher-ups. So we make our way to see Monroe, and from the moment we meet him, we can tell the sort of slimy corporate businessman he is, lying through his teeth throughout the entire interview before ushering Cole and Biggs away. But not before he shows them a list of his contractors, one of which is one Herbert Chapman, a known arsonist that opens up a conveniently perfect lead for Phelps to chase after. Tracking down Chapman, we find all the evidence we need to charge him in the back of his truck, but before the player can arrest him, he gets on a tram and makes a break for it, in one of the more unique driving set pieces in the entire game. Unfortunately though, Cole's forced to kill Chapman, or be killed himself, and any trace of a conspiracy might just have died with this loner pyromaniac. That being said, Biggs, unlike his past partners, is immediately open to Cole's new theory. He clearly believes there's more than meets the eye with this case, but once again, thanks to Cole's new reputation, there's no way the two would be able to investigate it without being cast out by the police department. A fact that's hammered home by Roy Earl coming to see Cole at the Blue Room to warn his former partner that he better stay away from Leland Monroe or suffer some dire consequences.
Stay away from Elysian Fields.
I should have known that you were playing errand boy.
You and your doofus partner. You have been warned.
Thanks for your cooperation, officer.
I love you.
Returning home to see his new love, Cole clearly has an idea of how to uncover Monroe's conspiracy, and luckily for him, a letter comes for Elsa that opens up the perfect opportunity. Elsa's friend Lou Buckwalter was killed in a construction site from a collapsing rooftop on a new Elysian Fields property, and she's been named the beneficiary for the insurance settlement. Cole, however, with the new information he has about Elysian, insists for her to reject the settlement, and instead to go see Jack Kelso, who we know is an insurance investigator at California Fire and Life. Cole's respect for Jack is clear as day. He knows full well that Jack would do the right thing given the opportunity, and he trusts Kelso to investigate the case just as well as he would, something that Cole at the start of the game would never admit. And whilst Elsa agrees, she encourages Cole to go see Jack, to be honest with him. However, Cole's still adamant that it's simply too late. And who knows, maybe Phelps is right, but now we have an opportunity to see for ourselves. Elsa finds Jack at his office in the California Fire and Life building and piques his curiosity quickly, not just with her mysterious behaviour but also with the case she brings him. Rejecting a $20,000 insurance settlement isn't something someone does every day, and after Lichtman mentions that she believes there's conspiracy involved, Jack can't help but take a look. Switching to Jack at this point is the perfect way to not only give Cole's arc a feeling of completion, but also provides the player a different perspective on Cole himself that exposes him for the hypocritical, undeserving man he used to be, the man Kelso knows him as at this point. Before Kelso can even begin investigating the case though, he's called up to his boss's office, one Curtis Benson, who's clearly perturbed by Elsa's inquiry. Essentially, Benson warns Jack not to investigate the case, to make Elsa accept the settlement at all costs, and to not ask any questions, but as we've seen from war flashbacks and newspaper scenes alike, that's not the type of man Jack is. So he drives over to the Elysian Field site, and after finding some pretty damning receipts for cement ingredients, he's confronted by one of the site's workers, who points him in the direction of the collapsed house. And when inspecting the house, Jack finds even more evidence of building standards simply not being followed. Poor quality timber with the name of a movie studio plastered across it. But before he can get a closer look, that same worker from earlier literally tries to bulldoze him. So yeah, it seems like someone doesn't want this case investigated. Of course though, this doesn't worry Jack in the slightest. In fact, it simply pushes him to dig even deeper. So after tracking down the film studio and quickly bribing the guard, Jack finally uncovers what's going on with the Suburban Redevelopment Fund, or at least some of what's going on. The film studio had been shut down a near decade earlier, but the place is still covered in old set timber, clearly the same timber being used to build Leland Monroe's matchstick houses. But it's not the timber that truly sets Kelso on the fund's trail, it's the video, the film reel he comes across in one of the offices of the studio, a film reel that depicts a conversation of each member of the fund. The mayor, the district attorney, the chief of police, the editor of the Times, Leland Monroe, Dr. Harlan Fontaine, and of course, Kelso's boss, Curtis Benson. Rushing to call Benson, Jack's warned once again to stay away from this case, to get Elsa to accept a settlement, and although Kelso is able to convince her to take the money, that by no means is him giving up on the case. Cole meanwhile sits in the background, communicating to Kelso through Elsa, but his femme fatale turned loving partner convinces him that he needs to be honest with Jack, that he needs to put their differences behind them for the greater good, and Cole finally agrees, knowing he can't do this without Jack's help. Before the two can peacefully reunite though, Jack heads over to another Elysian Fields law in the dead of night to try and garner some information about the fund and all its conspirators. When he gets there though, he quickly realizes that he's not alone. Some of Leland's thugs were sent to follow him, and although Jack tries his hardest to put up a fight, 3-to-1 odds means he ends up in the back of the gangster's car. Jack though, with all his wartime experience, clearly isn't new to all this, and on the drive he's able to hop out and escape, finding a car of his own and driving through the bright streetlights of LA in one of the best car chases in the entire game, reaching Elsa's apartment out of fear that she'll be targeted as well. But unbeknownst to him, Cole's there to ensure nothing happens to her, and as the two come face to face yet again, Jack can't help himself but get in a one-liner.
So you're still carrying that Army 45, Cole?
And once again, it's time for a war flashback, and this time we see Cole and Jack both in the heat of action, and how they deal with the circumstances they're laid. Whilst Jack is clearly a relentless leader, Cole has an obsession with keeping things clean. He's far more reserved, he gives inconsistent orders, and it leads his men to not only fall behind, but also to die. Whilst other units are using explosives to blow the entrances to Japanese caves, Cole just has to do it by the book. He sends his men in to clear out the caves by force, and because of this, Jack's forced to go back to hurry Phelps along. Cole's obsession with procedure that makes him such a great detective, his compulsion to do things by the book, makes him an abysmal war leader and gets his men killed. Yes, Cole may have been the higher rank, Cole may have had the better reputation, Cole might have even been the better man, but when it comes to the hard decision, when it comes to the heat of battle, Jack gets the job done. And even the great Cole Phelps needs help sometimes. Kelso wakes up in hospital to be greeted once again by Elsa, who clearly feels massively guilty for the danger she put Jack in by lying to him. But Jack, the truth-seeking, honest man that he is forgives her without question, because after all, she was right. Elysian, Suburban, Monroe, Benson, they were all in on it, and Jack still has no intention of dropping it. And luckily for him, an opportunity to keep investigating walks right in the front door at that very moment. Leonard Peterson, the assistant DA, is starting his campaign to take his boss's job as the district attorney, and needs Kelso's help doing it. Potentially the only clean politician in the entire city, Peterson wants to war a crusade against corruption in the LAPD, in particular with the Vice Squad, and it seems Jack's the perfect person to investigate. But of course, Jack has something even better for Peterson's election efforts. Leland Monroe and the rest of the corrupt megalomaniacs running LA, all lined up and ready to be charged. So, Kelso gets the job as DA investigator, and his first stop, of course, is Curtis Benson's apartment. It's time to pull the curtain back on his old boss's shady dealings, and while he goes in search of evidence of fraud, Jack finds something far, far more repulsive.
How old are you, princess?
16, mister?
How old are you really?
Nearly 13.
You take love where you can find it as you get older.
Love? That has nothing to do with love, Curtis!
Some might find your romantic notions endearing, Jack. I find them very tiring.
You're finished, Curtis.
After a quick chat with this disgusting predator, the depth of the Suburban Redevelopment Fund's plans comes to light. Through Elysian Fields, they plan on building thousands of new GI homes with cheap, unsafe materials, and then it seems as soon as they're ready, they're going to burn the houses to the ground, quick to claim the massive insurance payouts thanks to Curtis's sway in the insurance industry. It seems an unbreakable conspiracy, but thanks to Cole's incredible intuition, Jack's able to break the entire thing wide open, and Kelso makes sure to point that out to Benson before he leaves the pedophile to wallow in his wads of dirty money.
Maybe I can't work it out, but Phelps can. He may be many things, but he is one of the best detectives the LAPD has ever had.
Heading back to his office at Fire and Life to review Elsa's case file, Jack's interrupted by who else but the man himself, Cole Phelps, and finally, these two men who should be friends get an opportunity to talk face to face, away from the ears of Roy or Elsa, and after a little back and forth, Cole does something he's never done before. Cole, after facing a humbling like no other, after all he's gone through, after his LAPD commendations, his closed cases and his silver star, has nothing to say except sorry. He apologizes, not for what he did, but what he didn't do on Sugarloaf Hill. He apologizes for all he did to tear Jack down when they worked in the same unit. He apologizes to his wife for putting his family through hell. This apology is far more than just an attempt to reconcile with Kelso. It goes further than his wife or the men he let die in the war. It goes further than anyone and anything else. This apology, especially when it goes out to Kelso of all people, is Cole's way of finally forgiving himself for all the pain he's felt since he was given that war hero label. From the very moment he signed up with the LAPD, Cole was desperate to redeem himself, desperate to make a name for himself, to serve justice on the streets of LA, to make up for the injustices he caused in Okinawa, and to earn all that praise and all those rewards he felt he never deserved. But Phelps didn't for a moment stop and think to apologize. Apologize to the world for his flaws and his inabilities, for his lack of courage up on that hill. Although the two might not be friends, Jack knows Cole. The two understand each other perhaps better than any other two men could. And as Jack says, actually, he says it himself better than I ever could.
I know you, Cole. You're still beating yourself up over that medal on Sugarloaf. The medal you think you didn't deserve, but you just don't get it. Nobody deserves a medal. It's just the ridiculous situation you find yourself in and how you react to it. You think you failed up on that hill. But courage isn't a tap you can turn on or off. Courage isn't permanent. It's a tenuous and fickle thing. Courage and cowardice exist in every man. Get over it.
You got it off your chest.
I guess I have.
And with that apology off of Cole's chest, and that rant off of Jack's, the two men finally find themselves on equal footing. And now a humbled Cole does something he'd never dared to do back in the war. He asks Jack for help. So, Kelso heads over to the Hall of Records to take a closer look at the financials of the house Elsa's friend was buried under. After a quick minigame ripped straight out of Nintendo's Brain Training, he finds the ledger containing all the details of the Suburban Redevelopment Fund, including the names of each major member, including one he didn't expect, Courtney Sheldon. A quick gunfight with Leland Monroe's thugs later, and Kelso heads to the university to find Courtney and ask him what the hell he's gotten into. But Sheldon ensures Jack that he has no idea what the Suburban Redevelopment Fund even is, let alone that he's he's supposedly a part of it. As soon as Jack mentions Dr. Fontaine's name though, Courtney spills everything. He explains to Jack that he gave the morphine to Dr. Fontaine so that the doc could reinvest the money made in the building of GI houses. But of course, Courtney didn't have the full picture. He didn't know about the insurance fraud, he didn't know of Fontaine's plan or the suburban conspiracy, and it becomes clear pretty quickly that the whole time he was nothing but a fall guy for Fontaine and his gang of powerful elites. Jack heads back home, leaving Courtney confused, and as he reaches his downtown apartment, he gets a phone call from who else but the millionaire, Leland Monroe. The two trade barbs, with Leland showing he clearly considers Jack a threat, and in an attempt to eliminate said threat, Monroe invites Jack to his own house, but Kelso is by no means stupid. So before he heads to the Hollywood mansion, Jack goes back to his phone and calls up some of his old buddies. Meanwhile, as we see from a newspaper slightly later, Sheldon's desperately trying to clean up whatever mess he made with Dr. Fontaine, but tragically he makes one fatal flaw: trusting his own college professor, his own doctor. Fontaine's immediately taken aback by the fact that Courtney's found out about his schemes, and although Sheldon clearly believes the doc to still be innocent, Fontaine can't take any chances, and in a cruel twist of irony, he puts down Courtney with the very same morphine the young student gave him. Reaching Monroe's mansion with his old war unit by his side, Jack gets ready for a full frontal assault, resulting in what feels like a climax to the entire plotline, shooting your way through mounds of Monroe's thugs with the Hollywood Hills Manor as a stunning backdrop. And as you reach Monroe's study, all the evidence you could possibly need is laid right out in the open. A folder with the names of all the families whose houses were burned down, a notebook with Leland's entire payroll, including unsurprisingly Roy Earl, along with a case report written by Roy detailing the crimes of Dr. Harlan Fontaine, crimes that have been hidden on the grounds of Fontaine's cooperation with the fund.
He did whatever Fontaine asked. He had some kind of power over him. He did all the fires and then he went off the rails. I don't have a fucking name! He worked as a bug sprayer. Get me a goddamn doctor!
Everything is finally out in the open. Jack and Cole can come together and get justice. They can take down the system and all the corrupt figures that hold it up. Wouldn't that be nice? Well, the thing is, the world just isn't that simple. Before we can even attempt to finally reveal the conspiracy to the world though, we get another DLC case. Yup, after that massively climactic final showdown against Monroe, and the trail of the Suburban Redevelopment Fund being uncovered, Cole and Biggs are ready to strike against Dr. Fontaine and the rest of the conspirators. But before they can begin...
Jack's crossed the Rubicon and we have to be on the other side right now.
Christ, what was that?
Explosion. Something big.
You think it's the Reds? You think those Rusky sons of bitches that dropped the H-bomb on us?
At the very end of the game, in between the two most climactic cases, we get one more DLC case, which of course has to do everything on a grander scale than before. We get a citywide explosion, we get corporate espionage, we get military aircrafts, we get bodies in fridges, people with multiple identities, and some extra attempted murder on top of all that. But despite its grand scale, Nicholson electroplating might be the most forgettable case in the entire game. Whilst yes, it starts with the greatest spectacle we see in Alien War, the rest of the case quickly becomes a tedious, uninteresting slog that feels completely forced in and does nothing but mess up the pacing of this final act. With the momentum of the Suburban conspiracy ramping up, with Cole and Jack on the doorstep of uncovering the entire operation, we get this random, completely unrelated DLC case rammed in, which although provides an interesting premise, it doesn't fit at all with the tone of the Arson Desk itself, or the momentum of the game's overarching story. It's revealed pretty quickly that the explosion was a simple chemical accident, and after we find that out, the entire case is reduced down to chasing a former LAPD officer who's doing under-the-table deals to gain access to a new aluminium cleaning process. Yeah, that's actually the motive for the espionage and the numerous murders we come across in this case. As a case in itself, it's not the most interesting, but it's not terrible. The issue is that its placing in the story is so abysmal that it can borderline ruin the experience of the entire ending of the game, which is a real shame, because despite some flaws, the ending itself is absolutely beautiful. The beginning of the end of Alien War comes in Dr. Fontaine's medical practice, where we see Elsa confronting the doc about her friend's untimely death. For it was Fontaine that got Lou his construction job for Elysian, and knowing what she knows now, Elsa is positive that Fontaine is somewhat responsible. Harlan, though, as we now know, doesn't take too kindly to accusory visitors, and after a slight panic, he regains his calm and knocks Elsa out before she can make any more claims against him. Before Fontaine can finish the job, though, the doors of his office are kicked open, and in runs the cowboy, the man Courtney asked Fontaine to help, the man that was manipulated into burning down houses, the man who gained an appreciation, an obsession with death and destruction thanks to his PTSD from the war. And clearly not too pleased with the path Fontaine sent him down, the man wraps his hands around the doctor's throat and finally gets revenge for all the people who are dead thanks to Fontaine's greed. The man leaves the doctor incapacitated before hoisting Elsa into his arms and running out into the streets of LA before anyone can find out what he's done. Cutting to Jack, we see the new DA investigator looking for the man that Monroe put him on the trail of, this supposed southern exterminator, and on his way he finds one of the last two newspapers in the game. In the first, we see Cole and Biggs finding the corpse of Courtney Sheldon in an alleyway, and as they call for homicide, who else but Roy Earl strolls up, ready to take the case into his hands and presumably ensure Fontaine faces no accountability. But at this point, Cole is done rolling over for the police department, and most definitely for Roy, especially when it comes to the man laying at his feet. Pulling out his gun, Cole gives a fantastic speech in Courtney's honour, defending the young medic from Roy's jeers and showing his genuine respect for Sheldon.
Courtney Sheldon was a corpsman, Roy. He served his country. He went out with a medical kit and an Army 45 into places that made the Valley of Death look like a picnic. He was either naive enough or dumb enough to get involved in the Suburban Redevelopment Fund, along with the mayor, the DA, Monroe, and a certain crooked cop. He was involved in the morphine heist, but he has a puncture wound in his jugular, which makes this a murder case. He was a better man than you'll ever know. You say one more word about him and I will blow your fucking head off!
Roy stays his usual cocky self, but it's clear that he's perturbed by Cole's stand against him, and it once again shows the kind of man Cole really is. Cutting back to Jack, Kelso tracks down the arsonist's address before we're put back in Phelps' shoes at the house of Dr. Fontaine. Rusty lets Cole know what happened, how Elsa was captured, and immediately Cole leaps into action, investigating Fontaine's house to find a cabinet load of surplus morphine, as well as a map laying out the new LA freeway that's set to be built. The only problem is, the freeway goes straight through the new housing developments being built by the Suburban Redevelopment Fund. That's right, finally this twist is uncovered. All along, this was never just about simple insurance fraud from fires. No, Fontaine and Monroe planned to raise the value of the land tenfold by mass building new houses, houses that were actually worthless. But thanks to their dirt on Curtis Benson, they were able to sway the insurance company to inflate the value of the land massively despite the poor housing conditions. That way, when the plans for the freeway finally went through, the government would be forced to buy all the land from Leland Monroe and the rest of the fund at a massively inflated price, stuffing the pockets of the investors of the Suburban Redevelopment Fund with government money and leaving the returning GIs homeless. It could have been the heist of the century, all these massively powerful figures robbing the government blind, and it would have all gone through had Cole Phelps never discovered a flyer with Leland Monroe's face plastered on it. We cut back once again to Jack, who's found the house of the mysterious arsonist, and after some looking around, Jack puts the pieces together. The arsonist in question was Ira Hogaboom, one of the flamethrowers that Jack and Cole fought alongside in Okinawa, the flamethrower who was sent in to burn out Japanese caves. After Sheldon sent Ira to Dr. Fontaine, his affinity with fire was used to burn down the houses of people unwilling to sell their homes to Elysian Fields, but after he began killing people, Leland Monroe got nervous. He ordered Fontaine to cut off contact with Ira, and that pushed the veteran over the edge. Killing Fontaine, he fled to the sewers, and since he's still got Elsa captive, Jack knows what he needs to do. Kelso calls Peterson, asking for help with the cops, and then, despite being wanted by every dirty cop in the city, Jack calls Cole on the police radio and tells him to get down to the river ASAP. We get a fantastic chase through the city, with Cole protecting Jack from the mountains of police cars desperate to stop the man from reaching the river, but with the two working together, they're able to make it. And there, Cole and Jack prepare to enter the sewers, with Peterson ready to defend the two against the police chief and the rest of the department. But before we enter the sewers, we see Peterson, this supposedly clean-cut DA, hint at making a deal with the police chief to keep Kelso and Cole protected. Following this, we get a brilliant gunfight through the literal underworld of LA, taking on all the men Leland Monroe and his cronies have under payroll, the men trying to silence Elsa. And after making his way through them all and finding Ira, Jack realizes that Hogaboom this whole time was actually protecting the German Dane. Cole appears, ready to kill Ira, but Jack stops him. He reminds Cole that Ira's one of their own, and although at first Phelps doesn't recognize him, Ira sparks his memory very quickly.
Don't you remember me, Lieutenant? I remember you. No, don't. You ordered me to burn that cave, Lieutenant. That cave full of civilians. A hospital.
For the entire game, we thought that Cole was trying to get redemption for what happened on Sugarloaf Hill, for failing to act, for cowering away and letting his men die. And whilst that's certainly on Cole's conscience, there's something else, something greater. We see Cole and his troops surrounded by burning bodies, burning civilians. Cole ordered his troops to clear out a cave, a Japanese hospital filled with injured civilians. He made his men burn through innocent people, and to put them out their suffering, he orders his soldiers to execute them all. Cole committed a literal war crime, something that's clearly never left him, and he's rewarded with one Courtney Sheldon, the youngest soldier in his unit, the medic, raising his gun and... Cole is shot by his own men, by his own medic. But as we saw in the newspaper cutscene in Cole's speech defending Courtney, Phelps never held it against him. He knew that what he did was unforgivable. He knew that he deserved to die up on that hill, that he deserved to be shot, and he holds a massive amount of respect for Courtney, to break the chain of command, to go against orders, to go against his own country, and do what was needed to be done. Give Phelps what he truly deserved for his incompetency, his ignorance, and his borderline evil actions. In the final moments of the game, we're opened up to a whole new perspective of Cole's character. We finally have the full picture of this damaged war veteran, this man who let ambition get in the way of what was right, this cop who seeks nothing more than redemption for the pain he caused. He's been climbing an insurmountable hill to come to peace with what happened in Okinawa, but he knows he'll never truly be redeemed for what he did. He'll never be able to truly forgive himself for that unforgivable action. And he also knows that there's another man, a man he's never gotten on with, a man he's feuded with from the moment they met, a better man, a man who embodies honesty, embodies true justice, a man who can make tough decisions, a man who values life more than Cole ever could, a man who could have left Cole to die after Courtney shot him. But despite their differences, that man called for a wounded Cole to be taken to a hospital. That man got Cole honorably discharged from the war, and that man helped Cole in his most dire time of need. That man, of course, is Jack Kelso, and he's the one who's injured now. So Cole finally puts rivalries aside, and after getting Elsa out of the crumbling tunnel, he insists on Jack escaping before himself. He finally repays Jack for the decency that Kelso showed him all those years ago, and he can finally come to some kind of peace with who he is. He's Cole Phelps, top-class detective and terrible lieutenant. He's a good father and a bad husband, a friend to many and an enemy to many more. That is who Cole is, and that is who Jack and Elsa will always remember him as. And with that, Cole's washed away into the underworld of Los Angeles in one final act of redemption. As we hear the bells of a church ringing in the beautiful sunshine of LA, for a moment our hopes are raised, but as soon as we see the intricacies of Cole's funeral, our hearts sink into our gut. Roy Earl, thanks to Peterson's deal with the police chief, is standing as a free man, giving the eulogy at Cole's funeral, lying through his teeth about the man he destroyed. He claims Cole was falsely accused, he makes up for all of Cole's indiscretions, and he talks about Cole as a war hero, the very thing Cole told him he wasn't. Meanwhile, Elsa, Biggs and Jack sit watching, disgusted by the outcome of Cole's journey. Sure, Dr. Fontaine and Leland Monroe were convicted, but they were only a small part in such a bigger game, two cogs of an operation that has far more moving parts. The police chief, the DA, Roy himself, they all got off scot-free, and all the people who died for their cause will never get justice. Lou Buckwalter, Courtney Sheldon, Cole Phelps, all left to die in vain whilst the powerful and corrupt continue their march forwards. Cole may have made a difference, a genuine difference during his time in the LAPD, but his victories are short-lived. There was never any chance for Phelps to save LA by himself, no matter how much he tried, and his legacy will always be stained with all of those who escaped retribution. To the public, he will always be remembered as Cole Phelps the cop, and not as Cole Phelps the man. But to a small few, he'll be remembered for all the genuine good and all the evil that he had in his heart. They'll never forget the true man he was, and this memory will be none clearer than Jack Kelso's. Maybe the only other man who knew who Cole truly was. A man who, as Big said,
who recognized the need to remove the odd bad apple from a department made up of good men.
Herschel?
A man who never gave up.
Yeah, Jack.
Who continued to fight the good fight.
I think you knew that, Jack.
The fight that cost him his own life. A good husband. A good father. And may I say, a good friend.
LA Noire is one of my favourite games of all time, and I know that I'm in a minority when I say that, but it is the goddamn truth. And whilst I understand why it's disliked by many, I find it hard to criticise anything about this absolute masterpiece of storytelling. Sure, you can say it has clunky combat, stale gunplay, boring moment-to-moment gameplay, you can say the game's buggy or the facial animations are dated, but the fact of the matter is, in spite of all that, LA Noire was an absolute pioneer of the games industry. It took the Rockstar formula and flipped it on its head. It innovated entire new technologies to implement its insanely unique concept. The way it recaptures the feeling of classic noir films without for a moment feeling dated or unrelatable is a testament to the writing of Brendan McNamara and the rest of the writers at Team Bondi. The incredibly nuanced handling of harsh themes, the flawless characterization, and the near flawless use of non-linear storytelling, it all comes together to create a story that could easily stand on its own as a TV show or movie. But it's not a TV show or movie. It's a game that in many ways transcended the games industry, a game that reaffirmed the fact that games could be just as introspective, thought-provoking and relevant as any other medium. And whilst it may never get a sequel thanks to the muddled licenses and the tragic collapse of Team Bondi, it's safe to say that LA Noire will never be forgotten by those who played it. And hopefully, plenty more will get a chance to play this masterful cult classic in the years to come. If you've made it to this point, thank you so much for watching. I have poured my heart and soul into this video over the past couple weeks, and for that reason, it'd really be appreciated if you could hit like. Also, if you're new here and want to see more content just like this, make sure to subscribe and turn post notifications on so you don't miss another video. If you want to support the channel and help me make more videos like this, then my Patreon link is also in the description below. Any help is super appreciated. And with all that being said, thank you again. I've been Joe, aka Scarab, and I will see you in the next one.